The story of the Vanderlinde Gang is more than a tale of outlaws on stolen horses. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a wandering family trying to outrun a world that no longer has room for them. In the truest sense, their saga is an American tragedy written in dust, gunsmoke, and broken promises. From its humble beginnings in the 1870s, when Dutch Vanderlinde and Hosea Matthews met as rival conmen, each trying to rob the other, the world was changing. The railroads were carving through wilderness, banks were replacing saddlebags with ledgers, and the old ways were dying under steel and law. Two drifters with a philosophy of freedom decided to build something different, a makeshift family of the unwanted, a roaming community that would live outside civilization yet judge it all the same. The time span of this legend stretches across 3 decades, from the very beginning of Dutch and Hosea's partnership, through the gang's golden years of confident robberies and campfire sermons, to the early 1900s when the last bullets echo in the canyons and the dream finally dies. It crosses frozen camps in Coulter, humid nights in Lemoyne, and the choking smoke of St. Denis, until only a handful of survivors remain to remember what was promised and what was lost. At its core, this is a world built on binary tensions, idealism versus reality, as Dutch quotes political tracts and poetry to justify bloodshed. Freedom versus civilization, as the gang robs trains and banks in the name of resisting a rigged system that keeps tightening around them. Loyalty versus betrayal, as a family that swears to stand together discovers that secrets have been sitting between them at every campfire. Dutch becomes the living embodiment of these contradictions, preaching one thing while hiding another. Because behind every speech about freedom, there is something unsaid. Before the Pinkertons, before Guarma, Dutch was already lying to his own family, rewriting early cons with Hosea as noble crusades instead of reckless schemes that left innocents dead. He hoarded knowledge of money stashes, made quiet deals with men like Angelo Bronte, and entertained dangerous outsiders who fed his ego long before Micah ever rode into camp. Every time he said, "Trust me," there was a secret behind it. This video tells their complete story, from the first handshake between two conmen to the final stand on the cliffs above a dying West, with a relentless focus on every secret Dutch carried. His buried past, the lies he told Arthur and John, the silent compromises that doomed the gang long before Blackwater, all of it will be laid bare. In the end, the Vanderlinde Gang becomes a mirror held up to America itself, a nation built on dreams of freedom yet haunted by violence and hypocrisy. To understand why this family fell apart, the story cannot begin in St. Denis or Blackwater. It has to begin years earlier, with a Dutch no one in that camp ever truly knew. This is not a simple retelling of missions and cutscenes. This is a story of excavation, of pulling up every buried root beneath Dutch Vanderlinde's broken family and laying it in the light. From its humble beginnings in nameless frontier towns to the last lonely gunshots by a cliff and in the mountains, the aim is nothing less than a complete, chronological unmasking of Dutch's hidden life. That means no skipping ahead to the famous disasters and calling the case closed. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch responded with secrets. From the very beginning, there are lies told to Hosea about past crimes, quiet compromises with lawmen and rich men, and whispered promises made in the dark that never reached the campfire. Every hidden deal, every concealed body, every time he says, "Trust me," while holding back the truth will be traced, step by step, as the gang marches toward ruin. The promise here is completeness. The story will move from that first awkward encounter between Dutch and Hosea in the 1870s, through Arthur's adoption as a boy and John's arrival as another lost soul in need of purpose, all the way to the final betrayals and bullets that echo into Red Dead Redemption. Events already known will be revisited with new context. Dutch's secret negotiations with men like Angelo Bronte, his off-screen meetings with agents and enemies, his private stashes of money and information that turn a family into a hierarchy he controls. To keep that scope clear, the narrative will unfold in distinct beats: founding incident, ideological rise, expansion and recruitment, fractures and doubts, collapse under pressure, legacy in the ashes. At each stage, Dutch's philosophy will be tested against reality, against civilization closing in, and against the people who believe in him. The stakes are simple and devastating. Understanding Dutch's secrets means reinterpreting Arthur, Hosea, John, and the rest not as satellites orbiting a brilliant outlaw, but as the living embodiment of his dreams and delusions. His loyalty and betrayal made flesh. How many times does Arthur risk everything because Dutch withholds the full truth? How often does Hosea soften a lie for the sake of peace? How far does John bend himself to fit into a family built on foundations he never really sees? Yet this saga does not begin with Blackwater, Saint Denis, or Guarma. It begins with something stranger and more human than a grand heist. Two young conmen, both thinking they are the clever one. Two guns, two schemes, one deserted road. Each tries to rob the other, each realizes the trick. And in the shared absurdity of the moment, they laugh. That laugh, that failed con, becomes the spark for an idealistic partnership that will change the West forever. Before the Pinkertons, before the speeches, before the plans, it starts there. But for Dutch Vanderlinde, that laugh on the roadside is not the beginning. It is a detour. The story of Dutch truly starts years earlier, in shadows he never lets the gang see, in memories he trims and polishes until even he believes them. His early life is a haze by design. Ask 3 people who knew him in his youth, and 3 different fathers appear. In one telling, the man is absent, a ghost who walks out and never looks back. In another, he is cruel, a drunk with heavy hands and heavier words. Dutch never settles the question. He lets the contradiction hang, because the uncertainty serves him better than the truth. From its humble beginnings, his past is a weapon, something to be shaped, not confessed. What is known is this: a drifting childhood, cheap rooms and colder winters, a boy watching the world move on without him. The world was changing, railroads cutting through old towns, telegraph wires stitching distant cities together, and Dutch stood on the margins, an angry spectator. Then he finds books. Not holy texts or gentle stories, but political tracts, outlaw pamphlets, grand speeches about liberty and revolution. He reads philosophy he barely understands, romantic novels about doomed rebels, and he decides misery is not failure, it is oppression. Books give him language. They turn loneliness into destiny, resentment into theory, rage into a cause. In the truest sense, Dutch does not escape into fantasy, he arms himself with it. Freedom stops being a simple wish and becomes a banner he can raise over anything he does, no matter how bloody. Somewhere in those years, before Hosea, before Arthur, there is an incident Dutch never fully explains. Sometimes he hints at a foreman who cheated his mother, a man in a fine coat who ended up face down in a ditch. Other times it is a deputy, a badge in the wrong place at the wrong time, a confrontation that escalates too fast. The names change, the details blur, but one constant remains: Dutch walks away, someone else does not. Was it self-defense? Was it revenge? Or was it the first time he discovered how quickly principle can become an excuse? That hidden act becomes the quiet fulcrum of his philosophy. Authority is corrupt, civilization is a cage, and the only honest man is the one willing to break the rules first. He begins to retell the moment, sanding off guilt, adding necessity. A life taken becomes a sacrifice. A crime becomes a lesson. This is where his later hypocrisy is born, where every betrayal can be dressed up as strategy, every death as part of a plan. By the time Dutch meets Hosea on that lonely road, he is already rehearsed. He has a story ready, a wounded charm and a half-truth about why he hates the system. Hosea hears enough to recognize a mind like his own, but not enough to see the original scar. The gang that will become the living embodiment of Dutch's dreams and delusions is still years away. Yet its fate is already sealed in that unspoken history. Because from the very beginning, Dutch is not just running from the law. He is running from the one secret he will never let his family name. And the first time that secret demands another sacrifice, the gang will follow him into the dark, never knowing whose ghost they are really carrying. That ghost does not follow Dutch alone. It leads him, almost theatrically, to the man who will help him turn private shame into public philosophy. The story of the Vanderlinde Gang, from its humble beginnings, truly starts on a dusty road in the 1870s, with a stagecoach, a rich mark, and 2 outlaws who both believe they are the smartest man in the world. The target is simple on paper: a well-dressed businessman. Strongbox under his boots, guards too lazy to be alert. Dutch positions himself first, all confidence and posture, stepping into the road with a revolver and a speech about freedom from corrupt civilization. Hosea, watching from the tree line, has already picked the lock on the rear trunk and rehearsed his own exit. Each man thinks he is alone. Each thinks this is his perfect crime. The irony arrives with the coach. Dutch flourishes his gun, demanding the strongbox, while Hosea slips in from behind, blade ready to relieve the passengers of their jewelry. For a heartbeat, they almost pull it off. Then Dutch feels another hand on the same strongbox, turns, and finds a stranger staring back at him with the same amused calculation in his eyes. Two predators, one prize, and a coach full of witnesses waiting to see which outlaw will blink. This should be the moment when blood spills. Instead, it becomes a pattern interrupt that defines everything that follows. Dutch laughs first, a low theatrical chuckle that breaks the tension. Hosea answers with a dry smile, already measuring the angles. Rather than draw on each other, they draw on the guards, moving in unspoken tandem, covering gaps the other leaves. Within seconds, the coach is disarmed, the passengers cowed, and the two men are arguing not about territory, but about who had the better plan. Here, their character thumbnails come into focus. Dutch is charismatic and grand, speaking in sweeping terms about robbing the rich, about making a stand against a rigged world. Hosea is quieter, the living embodiment of caution and calculation, eyes always flicking to the horizon, already considering the consequences Dutch refuses to see. One dreams aloud, the other quietly tests every dream for cracks. The turning point arrives with a shrug and a decision. They split the take. That night, by a small fire under a wide, indifferent sky, they trade stories and philosophies. Dutch quotes half-remembered political tracts and insists the old ways were dying. Hosea counters with hard-earned lessons about conmen, sheriffs, and nooses. It is, in the truest sense, a meeting of delusions and experience, of idealism and survival. By dawn, something dangerous has settled between them. Dutch has found more than a partner in crime. He has found a witness to his ideals, someone who can refine his philosophy and make it sound less like a wounded boy railing at the world. He has also found the first person he can successfully lie to with a straight face. How long before that gift becomes a weapon? And how long before the family they build around that fire is asked to pay the price for secrets born on that road? Because this is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, and the next soul to be drawn into their orbit will prove just how powerful and how dangerous that new partnership truly is. From that road of shared deceit, the next step was inevitable. Two men who could lie to everyone else would eventually decide to tell each other the same lie, over and over, that together they could bend the world. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang is really a story of two men riding into an uncertain future, convinced they were the only ones who truly understood that the old ways were dying. In those early years, Dutch and Hosea moved constantly, drifting from town to town, rail stop to rail stop, living on small cons and improvised scams. Dutch played the charming outlaw preacher, denouncing civilization in saloons and rail cars, while Hosea watched the room, weighing risk, memorizing faces. One day they posed as railroad inspectors selling fake safety bonds, another, as bounty hunters escorting a prisoner who was really Hosea in chains. Each scheme tested more than their nerve. It tested whether the man beside them would run when things went wrong. Slowly, a rhythm formed. Dutch spoke first, smiled first, stepped into danger first. Hosea calculated, corrected, disappeared into the background when Dutch needed the spotlight. Without a word, a hierarchy emerged. Dutch as the voice and the face, Hosea as the planner and the quiet skeptic. Dutch told the story of who they were. Hosea made sure that story did not get them killed. And both understood, without ever saying it, that Dutch's version of events would be the one the world remembered. As they refined their partnership, they began to refine a philosophy. They told themselves they robbed from the rich, from bankers, rail barons, and swindlers, not from hungry farmers or desperate migrants. They avoided unnecessary bloodshed when they could, priding themselves on clean exits and frightened, not broken, victims. Above all, they swore, again, more in action than in words, that they would never betray each other, and never become the kind of petty tyrants and corrupt sheriffs Dutch railed against. In the truest sense, they believed they were building a family bound by loyalty and freedom, not fear. Then came the first secret that truly mattered. A bank shipment in a small town, a simple plan. Dutch distracts the manager. Hosea swaps the ledgers. No one gets hurt. But a nervous deputy misreads a movement, a gun goes off, and within seconds the street is chaos. Two bystanders fall, a woman on a porch, a clerk in the doorway. Innocent, nameless, dead, that night by the fire, Dutch rewrote it. He called it a tragic necessity, a sacrifice demanded by a corrupt world that would never grant freedom without blood. Hosea knew better. He saw the clerk's eyes, the woman's hand slipping from the railing. Yet he stayed silent. He did not challenge Dutch's story. In that silence, a template was born. Dutch would decide what had happened. Hosea would decide whether to fight him on it. And each time Hosea chose quiet, the future shape of the gang, its dreams, its delusions, its betrayals, was already being written in the dark. From that shared silence, an idea began to harden into a philosophy. Dutch's lies were not just about what had happened, they were about what should happen, about how the world ought to be. In the truest sense, he was building more than a gang. He was building a story of freedom that could explain every risk, every body, every whispered compromise in the dark. Dutch's emerging creed was simple to repeat and intoxicating to believe. Government was corruption in a fancy coat, civilization was a cage made of railroads and ledgers, and the old ways were dying under smokestacks and telegraph wires. Against that, he set a roaming outlaw family, self-sufficient and proud, answering to no court but its own code. They would rob banks and trains, yes, but only the rich, only the powerful, only the ones Dutch said were bleeding the world dry. Crime became rebellion, and rebellion became a moral duty. Hosea believed in much of it. He had seen judges bought, sheriffs bribed, railroad men carve up entire towns. His hatred of corruption matched Dutch's, but his philosophy had edges Dutch preferred to sand down. No needless cruelty, no blind suicide missions, always an exit plan when the law closed in. Where Dutch dreamed of grand gestures, Hosea insisted on limits, on counting bullets and weighing odds. One spoke in manifestos, the other in escape routes. Together, they turned the Vanderlinde outfit into a kind of outlaw utopia. Part family, part commune, part political statement, it gathered misfits and orphans who had nowhere else to go. A beaten woman fleeing a husband, a drifter who had lost his land, a half-starved boy caught stealing food in town. Each was folded into the firelight and told that here, at last, they mattered. From its humble beginnings, the campfire became a sanctuary, where a lost soul could earn a place with a rifle, a pot, or a song. Yet from the very beginning, contradictions crept in. Dutch preached equality, but everyone looked to him before they breathed. He spoke of shared wealth, yet he alone knew the full truth about money stashes, secret contacts, and quiet understandings with men in suits. The philosophy said no one man stood above the rest. The practice made Dutch the living embodiment of the dream, and the gatekeeper of everything that made it possible. Was it really freedom if one voice decided what freedom meant? Was it truly family if the father kept the ledger locked and the past buried? Each inspiring speech, each daring robbery justified as striking back at a rigged world, also tightened the circle around Dutch himself. The gang's utopia rested on a single, charismatic pillar whose history no one dared to fully examine. And in that hidden history, in those early secrets Hosea chose not to challenge, the seeds of the gang's destruction were already taking root. Seeds that would bloom the moment Dutch found a new admirer willing to tell him he was right, no matter the cost. From its humble beginnings, the gang is presented as a family bound by shared dreams, but beneath the campfire stories Dutch tells, a quieter architecture is forming. Before there is a name, before there is a proper camp, there is an agreement between two men who have already chosen secrecy over confession. The very beginning of that structure is not written down anywhere. It lives in glances, in pauses, in the way Hosea clears his throat when Dutch is about to say too much. The first rule is simple. Never question each other in front of outsiders. If Dutch spins a tale about rich bankers and corrupt rail barons, Hosea nods along, even if he knows the mark is a poor rancher with overdue loans. Disagreements are saved for behind closed doors, behind trees, behind the thin canvas of a tent. The second rule follows naturally. Always present already starting to feel unstable. When a recruit asks why a job went bad, Dutch explains, Hosea confirms. And the conversation ends. No one sees the doubt. No one sees the fear. The third rule is the most dangerous. Keep the inner workings of their partnership opaque to everyone else. Dutch and Hosea share everything with each other, every contact, every stash, every near miss that almost got them killed. But with recruits, information is rationed. A man might know the target, but not the reason. He might know the escape route, but not the backup plan. He might know where to stand, but never where the money ends up. Out of these rules, an unspoken hierarchy emerges. Dutch is the visionary leader, the outlaw philosopher who talks about freedom and civilization as if they are enemies in a grand, tragic play. Hosea is co-founder and conscience, the one who still remembers the faces of the dead when Dutch calls them necessary sacrifices. Beneath them are loyal soldiers like Bill and Javier, useful specialists who can track, shoot, or sweet-talk, and vulnerable strays who can be shaped into whatever the gang needs. It is sold as protection. Dutch tells them that the ugly parts are kept away from the kids, that some burdens are too heavy for young shoulders, that the world is changing and someone has to stand between the gang and the coming storm. But buried in that promise is a quieter lesson. Some people deserve the truth, and others only need the story. Is that family in the truest sense, or is it the first betrayal? These hidden rules hold, untested, until the first true child of the gang arrives. A scared, angry boy with his father in chains and nowhere else to go. His name is Arthur Morgan, and the system Dutch and Hosea have built will decide exactly what kind of man he is allowed to become. Arthur Morgan's story does not begin with the Vanderlinde Gang, or with grand speeches about freedom and civilization. It begins in a cramped, loveless world, in back alleys and rail yards, with a father who teaches all the wrong lessons and calls it survival. From its humble beginnings, this is already a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, pressed onto a boy who never had a chance to be anything else. Lyle Morgan is a petty criminal, drifting from town to town, dragging his son behind him. Arthur's mother dies when he is young, and the only model of manhood he receives is a man who steals because he cannot imagine another way to live. Arthur learns to pick pockets before he learns to read, learns to run before he learns to trust. When Lyle is finally arrested, paraded in chains, and hauled away, the law does not just take a father. It takes the thin, crooked structure that had been holding Arthur's life together. The result is a teenager effectively alone, half feral, already an outlaw in the eyes of a civilization that never bothered to know his name. That is the boy Dutch and Hosea meet, a teenager quick with his fists, quicker with his temper, slower with his trust. He is trying to rob a man on the road, and discovers, with a bitter flash of situational irony, that he has chosen a professional con man as his target. Dutch and Hosea could turn him in, beat him senseless, or ride on. Instead, they see a lost soul staring back at them. A short, brutal life or a prison cell, those are the paths already laid out. Dutch decides to offer a third. Dutch frames what happens next as salvation. Not charity, not pity, but a rescue with meaning. Around the campfire, he tells Arthur that he is not a criminal at heart, only a man the world has treated unfairly. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and men like them are simply refusing to lie down and be crushed. Dutch promises food, shelter, and something far more intoxicating, a narrative. They are not thieves, they are taking something back. How powerful is that to a boy who has only ever been told he is nothing? The dual mentorship that follows shapes Arthur into the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy. Dutch teaches him to read and to argue, to dress his anger in idealistic language about freedom, family, and honor. Hosea balances this with hard practicality, how to read a mark's eyes, how to plan a clean escape, how to know when a deal is already lost. One gives him a reason to fight, the other gives him the tools to survive. Between them, they turn raw fury into disciplined loyalty. In Arthur, Dutch finds more than a proc. He finds proof of concept. If this angry, broken boy can become a loyal, principled outlaw, then Dutch's worldview is not just talk, it is a working system. But that success makes Arthur too valuable, and too dangerous, to ever receive the full truth. How could Dutch risk telling him about the compromises, the secret deals, the early bodies left behind? The very beginning of their bond is also the beginning of a carefully managed illusion, one that must hold until the day Arthur starts to see through it. So Dutch begins with what sounds noble. He tells Arthur that the law is rotten to its core, that the badges and judges of this new America serve railroads and oil barons, not justice. He insists that rich men steal more in a single contract than any outlaw could in a lifetime, and that civilization is just a polite word for control. In Dutch's mouth, every robbery becomes a protest, every bullet a political statement. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang is framed as different. Dutch promises they will be honorable thieves, raiding banks and stagecoaches owned by the powerful, never preying on the poor unless there is no other choice. He speaks of freedom and family in the same breath, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of outlaws standing against a rigged world. Around the campfire, he repeats the same phrases until they become scripture. Protect the weak, look after the women and children, never harm the innocent without cause. But the things he does not say matter just as much. Dutch does not tell Arthur about the cons with Hosea that went wrong before the boy ever joined, about the simple jobs that ended with civilians dead on the floor and blood on Hosea's hands. He omits the quiet deals made in back rooms with local sheriffs willing to look away for a cut. He never mentions the first time he realized that being followed, being believed, is its own intoxicating power. Instead, Dutch edits. Every past failure becomes a noble sacrifice. Every misjudgment a tragic necessity forced on him by a cruel world. A botched heist is remembered as a brave stand against tyranny. A panicked retreat is retold as a calculated withdrawal to protect the family. In the truest sense, he is already rewriting history, turning his own fear and confusion into parables of leadership and vision. Arthur hears all this as a boy who has already lost almost everything. The son of a petty criminal, abandoned, drifting, a lost soul in a country where the old ways were dying and the world was changing too fast for anyone on the margins to keep up. When Dutch offers him a philosophy, not just a place to sleep, Arthur clings to it. He learns to read the books Dutch hands him, but he reads Dutch himself even more closely. For Arthur, Dutch becomes the living embodiment of purpose. If Dutch says the gang is righteous, then it must be. If Dutch says a bloody raid was mercy in disguise, Arthur accepts it. His identity forms around the belief that he is not merely a thief, but a soldier in a just war against a corrupt civilization. And that raises a dangerous question. If Arthur's entire sense of self is built on Dutch's version of the truth, what happens when the first cracks appear in that story, and how early do those cracks really begin to show? Those cracks do not begin in Saint Denis, or even in Blackwater. They begin on a quiet country road, on a night that was supposed to be a simple job, long before the gang believed itself legendary. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang told itself a story of purpose: rob the rich, spare the poor, live free on the margins while civilization closed in. One early heist, with Dutch, Hosea, and a teenage Arthur, seemed to fit that philosophy perfectly. The target was a wealthy landowner, a man whose name Arthur would remember, but whose face he would never quite forget. The plan, on paper, was routine. Stop the carriage, get the cash box, disappear into the trees. But Dutch treated it as theater from the very beginning. When the lanterns flared and the horses reared, he stepped into the road not as a bandit, but as if he were stepping onto a stage, coat flaring, revolver low at his side, voice calm and almost polite. What followed was not just a robbery. It was a performance. Dutch made the man climb down from his cushioned seat, boots sinking into the mud while his driver shook beside him. Instead of demanding the money first, Dutch demanded an accounting. How many men worked his fields? How many lived in shacks on wages that would never buy their own land? How many children went hungry while his table stayed full? He lectured the landowner about greed and injustice, about a world where the old ways were dying and the powerful wrote the laws to protect themselves. Dutch spoke of freedom and family, of a West that belonged to those who worked it, not those who inherited it. He forced the man to hand silver from his pockets to his own driver, to the terrified farmhand beside him, turning the holdup into a twisted kind of political theater. Arthur watched from the shadows, rifle ready, heart pounding. To a boy who had been little more than a lost soul before Dutch and Hosea found him, this was mesmerizing. Here was an outlaw who did not just steal, he preached. He seemed, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of his own philosophy, an outlaw philosopher king humiliating a tyrant, not merely lining his pockets. But there was a secret layer to that night, one Arthur never saw. Hosea noticed it in the way Dutch said the man's name, with a venom that did not match the speech. Years earlier, that landowner had cheated Dutch's father in a land deal, leaving the old man disgraced and broken. Dutch never told the gang that part. He turned private vengeance into public principle, and no one questioned where justice ended and ego began. That is the pattern interrupt hidden in this early story. From that muddy road onward, every statement Dutch made carried two weights at once. Was he striking at a corrupt world or at his own ghosts? And when the stakes grew higher, who would be able to tell the difference? Those questions hang over the gang long before anyone can answer them. And the next test of Dutch's philosophy arrives in the shape of another boy with nothing. If Arthur was the proof that Dutch could build a family from its humble beginnings, John Marston would become the reminder that not every lost soul fit the story being told. John's early life is bleak even by the cruel standards of the dying frontier. Born to a drifting outlaw father and a mother who died when he was young, he is handed off to an orphanage that promises structure and charity, but delivers abuse and neglect. The place is a warehouse, not a home, a corner of civilization where unwanted children are beaten into silence. John learns quickly that adults are dangerous, that institutions lie, that loyalty is a word spoken by people who intend to leave. So he runs, a thin teenager on the road, half-starved and angry, stealing bread, lifting coins, slipping into petty crime because nothing else in this world will keep him alive. There is no stable sense of home, no guiding hand, only hunger and the quiet, simmering belief that anyone offering help must want something worse in return. From the very beginning, his story is not about belonging, it is about survival. Dutch meets him where he meets so many people, in the aftermath of a robbery gone wrong. John, trying to hold up the wrong target, is cornered and desperate when Dutch and Hosea intervene. Two seasoned conmen, one ragged boy, and for a moment it is almost comical. Three outlaws all trying to rob the same future at once. Dutch sees more than a bungled crime. He sees an echo. Another broken child wandering a world that is closing its doors. To Dutch, this is another chance to prove his philosophy in the truest sense. He takes John in, speaks to him not as a criminal but as a son, in waiting, promising freedom, family, and a higher purpose than simple theft. If Arthur was the living embodiment of what Dutch believes he can create, John is the next experiment, a harder case that will show whether the dream can reshape even the most wounded spirit. Yet, from the start, John is no Arthur. Arthur, already bonded to Dutch, is eager to please, internalizing the gang's idealistic language about justice and rebellion. He trusts Dutch's words almost by instinct. John listens, but holds back. He is guarded, skeptical, weighing every speech against the cold arithmetic of his own experience. Why trust a man just because he speaks beautifully about freedom and the old ways that are dying? This difference breeds tension. Arthur resents John's attitude, seeing it as ingratitude toward the man who saved them both. John bristles at Arthur's open loyalty, reading it as naivety, even weakness, in a world that has never been kind. Dutch steps between them, playing mediator, the wise father balancing two very different sons, enjoying the role more than he admits. In those early years, that friction feels manageable, even useful. But in bringing John into the fold, Dutch also brings in a long-term threat to his own myth. John stands half inside and half outside the story Dutch is selling, close enough to benefit from it, distant enough to question it. When the speeches stop matching reality, when the plans grow thinner and the betrayals thicker, who will notice first, the devoted son or the boy who never fully believed? John's doubt is a spark. It does not burn the gang down at once, but it never quite goes out. From the very beginning, Arthur and John are set up as opposing answers to Dutch's philosophy. Arthur is the dutiful son, the living embodiment of loyalty, raised in the gang, shaped by Dutch's words, convinced this outlaw family is different from the predators of civilization. John is the stray taken in later, grateful yet wary, already scarred by the world. Where Arthur leans in, John hangs back. Where Arthur, wealthy rancher, Dutch insists is cruel to his workers. Arthur nods, trusting the story. John asks how Dutch knows, whether this is justice or just another score. On rides back to camp, Arthur calls him a pessimist, a man who cannot see the bigger dream. John fires back that dreams do not change the bullets in a man's gun. It is a story of freedom and family, but also of two young men arguing over what those words actually mean. Dutch watches this tension with interest. He praises Arthur's loyalty, telling him he is the rock, the one who understands that faith is the glue holding their world together. Later, he praises John's independence, calling him a free thinker, a man who will not bow to civilization's lies. In the truest sense, Dutch makes himself the only bridge between them. Only he claims, can translate Arthur's devotion and John's doubt into something useful. As the years pass, the stakes rise. Dutch withholds more information, keeps the real risks and side deals close to his chest. A town bank job that cannot fail, a train carrying more guards than promised. A deal with a local magnate whose name Dutch never quite explains. John starts to ask sharper questions. Who tipped Dutch off? Where the money is really going? Why innocent people keep ending up dead when they were supposed to be necessary sacrifices? At first, Dutch soothes him, talks of trust, of the old ways were dying, of how men like them must act boldly or be crushed. When that fails, the tone hardens. Doubt becomes disloyalty. Questions become insults. Arthur, standing beside Dutch, takes the message. He defends Dutch in arguments, calls John ungrateful, accuses him of forgetting who pulled him out of the mud. Each defense isolates John a little further, turning healthy skepticism into a private burden he carries alone. One day that burden will be the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe, and by then, Dutch will have every reason to make sure John's questions are never heard again. John's doubts stay unspoken, buried under Dutch's charm and Arthur's loyalty, just as the gang begins to change shape. What started as a tight knot of 4 men on the run begins to swell into something larger, stranger, and in the truest sense more dangerous. The first new faces arrive one at a time, each carrying their own private ruin. Bill Williamson stumbles into their orbit half drunk and half broken, a discharged soldier whose only real skill is taking orders and pulling a trigger. In the army, he was a blunt instrument. Out here, he is nothing at all. Dutch sees him, studies the insecurity behind the bluster, and spins it into a story of redemption. The world was changing, Dutch explains, and men like Bill were cast aside by a civilization that only valued them when they were killing on command. With Dutch, Bill is not a failure. He is a soldier of a higher cause. Then comes Javier Escuela, guitar on his back, a revolutionary without a revolution. He has fled executions and betrayals in Mexico, carrying romantic dreams of freedom and justice that have nowhere to land. Around the campfire, he sings songs of lost comrades and failed uprisings, and Dutch leans in. Here is a man who believes in philosophy, in ideals, in the old ways of resistance even as the old ways were dying. Dutch tells Javier that America is just another corrupt regime in need of shaking, and that the Vanderlinde Gang is not merely a band of outlaws, but the living embodiment of that struggle. Others follow, drifters, gamblers, runaways, each one a lost soul who has discovered that the law protects property more than people. Dutch and Hosea never introduce them as hired guns. They are brothers and sisters, given roles that come with dignity. One cooks, one scouts, one minds the horses, one keeps watch. Their failures in the outside world become proof that society, not they, are broken. From its humble beginnings, the gang turns into a story of second chances told around a fire. The camp itself evolves from a rough hideout into a moving village. There are shared meals, chores, music drifting through the trees. Children chase dogs between wagons. Arguments flare over whose turn it is to haul water, then fade into laughter. For many, this is the first real family they have ever known, a place where last names and past crimes matter less than loyalty today. Beneath the warmth, though, the old hierarchy hardens. Dutch and Hosea control the planning, the money, the secrets. Arthur and John become senior enforcers, riding point on dangerous work while newer members are kept away from the bloodiest decisions for their own good. Who robbed which train? Who decided to spare which informant? Every compromise. Except Dutch. The larger this family becomes, the easier it is for him to disappear inside it. And one day, that crowd will be the perfect place to hide a betrayal. That crowd does more than hide a betrayal. It hides a pattern. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang survives on repetition, vanish, regroup, strike, disappear. The rhythm becomes a story of its own. First comes the search for a remote hollow or tree line where wagons can circle and fires can burn low. Then scouts ride out, mapping roads, banks, rail lines, and the temperament of nearby towns. Only when Dutch and Hosea know the lay of the land does the real work begin. For a time, that cycle feels almost noble. Camps in the early years are tucked into forests and river valleys where the world seems far away, where the crackle of fire and the murmur of voices create the illusion of a small, chosen civilization. Jobs are planned around Dutch's philosophy of striking the rich and corrupt, and the camp buzzes with a strange, idealistic pride. In the truest sense, these places become the living embodiment of Dutch's promise, freedom, family, and a future carved out of a hostile world. But every camp develops its own personality, and those personalities tell a harsher truth. A wooded hideout where laughter is common and arguments are rare gives way, years later, to a low riverside camp where tempers flare and the watch rotations grow tighter. A mountain clearing that once symbolized safety becomes a prison of snow and hunger. The more the gang moves, the more that rhythm of arrival and departure feels less like strategy and more like running. Outside their firelight, the world was changing. Railroads pushed deeper into the frontier, iron tracks stitching together what used to be distance and safety. Telegraph wires hum over their heads, turning days of travel into seconds of information. Banks centralize wealth, cities grow taller and richer, and the Pinkertons follow those same lines of progress straight toward the gang's door. What does it mean to be a horse-riding outlaw when the law can outrun a horse with steam and copper wire? Dutch feels that pressure long before most of the camp can name it. To him, every new telegraph pole is an insult, every rail line an invasion. He rails against civilization and progress around the evening fire, insisting that the gang's way of life is purer, more honest than the cities that brand them criminals while stealing entire nations. In his speeches, the old ways were dying, and only the brave would stand against the tide. Yet with each move, the contradiction grows. The gang depends on trains even as it robs them, uses roads and towns even as Dutch condemns them. He refuses to adapt, to modernize his methods or his thinking, clinging to an era that no longer exists. The law is on their heels, but something worse is gaining on them too. They are not just outrunning posses and Pinkertons, they are outrunning time itself. And Dutch's refusal to face that truth will become one of his most dangerous secrets of all. The law was tightening. But the first real shadow that fell over the Vanderlinde Gang did not wear a sheriff's badge or ride under a territorial flag. It rode under a corporate letterhead, paid in banknotes and railroad bonds. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency entered the story as the living embodiment of a new kind of power. From its humble beginnings as a band of idealistic outlaws robbing stagecoaches and small-town banks, the gang had always dealt with local posses and marshals. Those men could be outsmarted, outridden, even outdrunk. The Pinkertons were different. In this world, they functioned as a private army for railroads, oil barons, and investment houses. A hired fist for the very civilization Dutch claimed to be resisting. Their mandate was simple: hunt, disrupt, and dismantle gangs like Vanderlinde, then present the bill to the highest bidder. The first signs were almost trivial. Anonymous riders on distant ridgelines who never came close, but never quite disappeared. Strangers in cheap suits asking careful questions in Valentine and Strawberry. Had anyone seen a tall man with a mustache and a silver tongue, traveling with a woman and a sickly boy? A telegraph clerk in Rhodes mentioning, in passing, that some agency men had been through, checking train schedules and recent robberies. Was it paranoia or pattern? Rumors hardened into a name: the Pinkertons. Men who had broken strikes, infiltrated unions, and brought down bigger outfits than Dutch's. Around the campfire, the gang traded stories, agents hiding among workers, detectives posing as drifters in saloons. Raids that came at dawn with ruthless precision. It sounded less like law enforcement and more like a quiet war waged on behalf of money itself. Publicly, Dutch met this new threat with disdain. To the gang, he framed the Pinkertons as just another arm of the corrupt system, no different in the truest sense from a bought sheriff or a crooked judge. He told them that as long as they stayed smart, stayed moving, and stayed loyal, they had nothing to fear. Civilization might send its dogs, but free men did not bow to collars. Wasn't that the philosophy from the very beginning? Privately, Dutch's confidence cracked. He began drawing alternate routes on worn maps, marking remote cabins, caves, and river crossings that could serve as emergency bolt holes. He arranged hidden stashes of money and weapons far from camp, insurance policies no one else knew about. With Hosea, he spoke in low tones about possible alliances with local crime bosses and politicians, men who could muddy trails and misdirect attention. Arthur and John heard almost none of this. To them, Dutch repeated the same refrain: "Trust me, have faith, the plan is working." The secrecy was a betrayal wrapped in reassurance, a quiet centralization of power inside a man already drifting toward paranoia. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch meant to face that alone, even as he preached family and freedom. That decision, to keep the full scale of the Pinkerton threat hidden, would not just shape their next move. It would lead them, step by confident step, toward one of the gang's most disastrous choices yet. But for one night, that disastrous choice felt distant. The air was still, the camp fed and flush from a job that had actually gone right. And for the first time in days, the only gunfire came from Bill trying to hit empty bottles and missing half of them. Around the main fire, Karen sang a rough little ballad. Javier picked at his guitar, and cards slapped softly against a crate as Tilly and Uncle argued over who was cheating whom. Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John sat apart at a smaller fire, the glow lower, the voices quieter. It was a little island inside their roaming world, a place where the smoke rose straight for once instead of being torn by wind or gunpowder. Dutch poured coffee like it was fine brandy. Hosea leaned back with a blanket over his shoulders, and the two younger men waited. Nights like this were rare, and everyone knew it. What story would be told? What truth would be safe to say aloud? Hosea spoke first, not with one of his polished cons, but with something that sounded, in the truest sense, unfinished. He talked about a winter long before Arthur, when he and Dutch tried to run a riverboat game on men who were meaner, drunker, and far less stupid than expected. The cards turned, the pistols came out, and one scared kid at a nearby table took a bullet meant for Hosea. He remembered the boy's eyes. He remembered running. He remembered Dutch calling it a necessary sacrifice. For once, Hosea did not dress it up as a clever escape. He admitted the fear, the way his hands shook afterward, the months he could not sleep without seeing that dead stranger's face. He spoke of Bessie, of how she asked whether the money had been worth another grave on a nameless hill, and how he had no answer. It was a story of cost, of the quiet bill that outlaw dreams always send in the morning. Dutch listened, smiling faintly, then let the silence hang just long enough to reclaim the stage. When he finally answered, his voice turned the firelight into a spotlight. He went back to the very beginning, to his father, the preacher who lost his faith in civilization, to hungry knights and angry sheriffs, to a young man who decided that freedom meant standing up to power with a gun in one hand and a philosophy book in the other. He spoke of rescuing abused women, of robbing only the rich and corrupt, of riding with Hosea from its humble beginnings as two men against the world to a family bound by loyalty and ideals. The darker memories, the innocent caught in crossfire, the cons that turned to massacres, the compromises with men as cruel as Colm, vanished beneath noble speeches and inspirational turns of phrase. When John, half smiling, asked about a botched job in Kansas City Hosea had once mentioned, Dutch laughed, waved a hand, and answered with charm instead of detail. Arthur drank in every word, the living embodiment of a disciple hearing scripture. John watched the gaps. He saw the places Dutch skipped, the questions that slid away on a joke, the way the man's eyes hardened for a heartbeat whenever reality brushed too close. In that quiet, the central tension of their family revealed itself. In a camp built on stories, whoever controlled the story controlled what was real. Hosea had offered his scars. Dutch offered his legend. And even on a peaceful night, with the fire low and the guns holstered, Dutch was already editing the past to secure his place in the future. Dutch's control of the past was only half the story. The other half sat under lock and key, buried in wagons, riverbanks, and hollow trees. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang had an official system for money, a ritual that made crime feel almost honorable. Every major score, every bank or train or stagecoach that went right ended the same way. The take went into the communal box at camp. That box was more than wood and iron. It was the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, the proof that this was not just a pack of thieves but a family bound by shared purpose. The money paid for ammunition, horses, medicine, bribes to lawmen, and small comforts that made the hard road bearable. Above all, it was framed as the seed of a promised future, the escape fund that would one day buy freedom in some distant land beyond the reach of civilization. Dutch preached that it all belonged to everyone, that no one was richer or poorer inside the circle of the fire. Yet even in those early days, before Blackwater, before Saint Denis, another system was quietly taking shape. On certain robberies, a percentage never reached the box. Dutch and sometimes Hosea would peel it off at the edges, set it aside, and hide it in places no one else knew. These were the emergency funds, the caches Dutch insisted the others did not need to worry about. A little under a floorboard in a rented room. A bundle wrapped in oilskin and buried near a landmark only he remembered. A roll of bills left with a discreet contact in town. In the truest sense, the gang now had two treasuries, the one everyone could see, and the one only the leaders could touch. On the surface, it made a certain brutal sense. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch argued that a visionary needed reserves, contingencies, hidden lifelines. But there was a quieter truth beneath the rhetoric. Whoever controlled the hidden stashes controlled the escape, and whoever controlled the escape controlled the future. Was this still about shared dreams? Or was it about one man's power to decide who got to chase those dreams at all? Small cracks appeared long before anyone called it betrayal. Arthur would return from a job, count what went into the box, and feel a nagging sense that the numbers were light. Javier would ask how much they had toward the big plan, only to receive a vague answer about more than enough. John, already half outsider, would hear Dutch mention money in some distant town he had never seen. Each time, the questions rose and then died. Dutch had raised Arthur. Hosea vouched for the system. Challenging the math meant challenging the man who had given them family, purpose, identity, so they chose loyalty over suspicion, story over arithmetic. How many revolutions, after all, had been undone not by enemies, but by ledgers no one was allowed to read? Those hidden caches would not stay abstract forever. When the law closed in, when the Pinkertons tightened the noose and the gang scattered, the question of where the money really was stopped being philosophical and became a matter of survival. In the chaos to come, guns would be drawn, alliances would shatter, and beneath all the shouting one cold fact would remain. Dutch Vanderlinde was the only man who truly knew where the last hope of escape was buried. Dutch's hidden stash of money was not his only secret. Long before that final cache became a lifeline, Dutch had been hoarding something even more dangerous: relationships. Quiet arrangements, deals made in the dark with men the gang never truly saw. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang had always been a story of outlaws standing against a rigged world, but Dutch's methods for surviving that world were not as pure as his speeches. Micah Bell, with his poisoned tongue and flattery, was only the latest in a long line of volatile outsiders Dutch entertained. Dutch had a weakness for men who echoed his hatred of the system, who called him a visionary, who promised that together they could bend civilization to their will. That pattern did not appear overnight, it had been there from the very beginning. In small frontier towns and growing rail hubs, Dutch would slip away from camp under some pretext of scouting or negotiation. Hours later, he would be found in the back rooms of saloons, sharing whiskey with local crime bosses, or in dim sheriff's offices where the lawman's badge was little more than an ornament. A corrupt sheriff in New Hanover who agreed to lose arrest warrants, a railroad fixer who paid for silence, a cattle baron who wanted a rival's herd to vanish. Each arrangement was presented to the gang as a simple opportunity. Easy money. A favor for a favor. The political implications, the way these deals tied the gang to the very power structures Dutch claimed to despise, remained unspoken. Hosea saw the danger. In private, away from the campfire and the adoring eyes of the younger men, he would press Dutch with hard questions. Was this still men in tailored coats? Hosea warned that these compromises bound them to people they could not control, men who would sell them out the moment it proved profitable. Dutch answered with practiced certainty. These were necessary evils, he said, short-term sacrifices for long-term freedom in a world where the old ways were dying. The secrecy was the point. Dutch met these figures alone, or with only one trusted escort, often Arthur or Javier, and even then he rarely shared the full conversation. He returned to camp with new plans and new enemies, demanding loyalty without providing clarity. "Trust me," he would say, and the gang did, because the alternative was admitting their leader might be gambling with their lives on terms they did not understand. Each hidden alliance tightened his grip as the sole interpreter of the outside world, the only man who claimed to see the whole board. One alliance in particular would dwarf all the others. In the shining, smoke-choked sprawl of Saint Denis, Dutch would shake hands with a man whose influence reached from the docks to the governor's mansion. On paper, it would look like salvation, the final bridge from outlaw chaos to untouchable prosperity. In truth, it would be the doorway to their ruin. And by the time the gang understood what Dutch had promised in that city of progress and illusion, it would already be far too late. But before Saint Denis offered its shining illusion of legitimacy, there was another job that quietly rewrote the gang's soul. It did not happen in a marble bank or a governor's office. It happened in the mud, in the soot, in the shadow of a mine that pretended to be progress. Dutch had always claimed the gang robbed parasites, not people. From its humble beginnings, his philosophy drew a clear line: prey on the rich, spare the innocent. Never become the thing being fought. So when word came of a railroad-backed mining company paying starvation wages and beating its workers into the ground, Dutch seized on it instantly. This, he said, was a story of justice, not greed. A payroll wagon, a corrupt foreman, and a chance to strike a blow at civilization itself. On paper, the plan was simple: hit the wagon on a back road, scare the guards, take the money, vanish into the trees. No workers, no townsfolk, no blood. In Dutch's mind, it was, in the truest sense, a perfect expression of their ideals. But the world was changing, and so were the risks. The company had heard rumors. The wagon rolled out with more guns, a faster schedule. And a surprise, it cut through a small workers' camp where families had gathered to beg for overdue pay. That was the pattern interrupt. Instead of a clean ambush in the open, the gang found themselves riding into chaos. Children in the road, women shouting, guards panicking, rifles swinging in every direction. A shot went off too early, a horse reared, a guard fired wildly into the crowd. In a heartbeat, the scene turned from robbery to massacre. Arthur saw a woman fall, clutching her side. He saw a boy screaming over a man who would never stand again. Every instinct told him to pull back, to drag Dutch away, to let the money go. For a moment, even Bill and Javier hesitated, caught between the plan and the horror unfolding in front of them. What mattered more now, the score or the code they had been raised on? Dutch answered that question. He did not call a retreat. He ordered them forward. Kill the guards, grab the bags, ride hard. The blood, he shouted, was on the company's hands. This was the cost of freedom, the price of confronting tyranny. Later, around the campfire, he would polish that moment into a sermon about sacrifice and destiny, about how the old ways were dying and men like them had to do terrible things so others would not have to. Arthur did not forget the faces in the dirt. The gang had not robbed to eat that night. They had become the living embodiment of Dutch's ego and ideology, even as their own moral code bled out on that road. And once a line like that is crossed, how easily can it be crossed again? That road became a turning point Arthur could not name yet, a moment when admiration began to carry a quiet aftertaste of fear. The story of Dutch's greatness had always excused the blood, the risk, the long nights running from civilization. Now, for the first time, the cost lingered longer than the speech. The shift did not arrive with a single betrayal or a grand revelation. It crept in through small, cumulative moments: a woman begging in the street in Valentine, Dutch tossing her a coin with theatrical flourish, then muttering that if she starved it was the fault of the damned system, not his. A wounded coachman left groaning in a ditch after a robbery. Dutch glancing back only long enough to say they could not afford witnesses. Once, those faces would have earned a story, a justification, a promise that their suffering meant something. Now they were background noise. From its humble beginnings, the gang had believed Dutch when he claimed every plan served a higher purpose: rob the rich, spare the poor, protect the family. But as the months after Blackwater dragged on, his plans began to feel different. Riskier, less careful. He talked more about grand gestures and less about safe exits. A bank in a town crawling with lawmen. An ambush on a train guarded by soldiers. Was this still philosophy, or only pride dressing itself in long words? Arthur started to notice how Dutch handled questions. Some were welcomed, even rewarded, so long as they gave him a chance to perform his ideals. Others were brushed aside with a smile that never reached his eyes. Where exactly was all the money from Blackwater stashed now? Why had certain enemies, once condemned as beyond forgiveness, suddenly become useful men trying to survive in a cruel world? And why did the story of the gang's early years shift, detail by detail, each time Dutch retold it around the fire? In one version, a botched con that left innocents dead was a tragic necessity. In another, it had never happened at all. Hosea would look down when those parts came up, his silence louder than Dutch's speeches. Arthur felt the edges of two histories grinding against each other, and somewhere between them stood the man he owed everything. That loyalty created a knot in his chest. Dutch had taken him in as a lost soul, given him a name, a code, a family in the truest sense. Questioning Dutch felt like questioning his own existence. Yet the unease would not fade, especially when a plan seemed designed less to feed the camp and more to prove that Dutch Vanderlinde could not be cornered, could not be doubted, could not be wrong. One night at Clemens Point, with the camp quiet and the fire burned low, Arthur finally went to Hosea. The older man sat with a book in his hands and exhaustion in his eyes. The world was changing written in every line of his face. Arthur spoke carefully, circling his concerns as if they were wild animals. Dutch was different. He was colder, more secretive, quicker to gamble lives he once would have protected. Hosea listened without interruption, jaw working, fingers motionless on the page. When Arthur finished, Hosea did not rush to defend Dutch, nor did he condemn him. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and admitted that he had seen the same things. Dutch was drinking his own philosophy now, he said, believing the speeches more than the reality. The old ways were dying, and Dutch could not bear a world where he was not the living embodiment of resistance. But Hosea clung to hope. They had brought Dutch this far, he argued. Perhaps together they could guide him back. Keep him grounded. Remind him of the man he had been at the very beginning, when their rebellion was more than theater and blood. Arthur wanted to believe that, needed to believe it. The alternative meant accepting that the man who had saved him was leading them toward a cliff. What neither of them knew, as the fire cracked softly between them, was that Dutch had already stepped over an invisible line. Deals had been whispered in back rooms, names traded, futures wagered without a word to the family that trusted him. By the time Arthur began asking the right questions, Dutch had already set in motion decisions that no amount of loyalty or late-night honesty could ever undo. By the time Dutch's secrets began to surface, John Marston had already been living with a quieter secret of his own. He had never trusted Dutch as completely as everyone assumed. From the very beginning of his adulthood in the gang, John had been the one who asked the wrong questions at the wrong time. Why this risk? Why this town? Why this man? Years before Blackwater, before St. Denis and Guarma, John had pushed back against Dutch's grand designs in ways that were easy to dismiss. When Dutch proposed alliances with men like Angelo Bronte, or shadowy politicians who spoke the language of civilization while dealing in blood, John's jaw would tighten. He would stand at the edge of the group, arms folded, and ask what exactly they were getting in return. Dutch would answer with philosophy, with speeches about freedom and the old ways dying, but rarely with details. John heard the gaps. To the others, especially in those earlier years, that resistance looked like youthful rebellion. Arthur saw a boy who disappeared for months, who resented authority, who pushed back not because the plan was wrong, but because he hated being told what to do. Dutch framed it the same way. John was headstrong, ungrateful, a lost soul who did not yet understand the greater good the gang was serving. The camp accepted that story because it was easier than admitting that Dutch's plans were becoming harder to explain. But as Dutch's behavior grew more erratic, John's doubts stopped sounding petulant and started sounding prophetic. After Blackwater, when Dutch refused to explain why the ferry job had gone so catastrophically wrong, John's old questions suddenly had weight. When Dutch entertained Micah's whispering counsel, when he spoke of Tahiti in the same breath as massacres and train robberies, John's skepticism became the living embodiment of a warning no one wanted to hear. Key moments drove that change home. In Rhodes, when Jack was taken and Dutch steered the gang into the Braithwaite and Gray feud, John's fury was not just paternal, it was accusatory. How could a man who preached family allow a child to be used as leverage? Later, in St. Denis, when Dutch demanded total commitment for the bank heist while Abigail and Jack waited in a city crawling with Pinkertons, John hesitated. He argued for caution, for an exit, for a life beyond Dutch's dreams and delusions. Dutch heard only betrayal. Arthur, standing between them, began to see the pattern. John's distance was not cowardice, but a different kind of loyalty. To Abigail, to Jack, to a moral line he refused to cross even when civilization closed in. Arthur, still trying to save Dutch, clung to the idea that the man he admired could be pulled back from the brink. John, watching the same man gamble children and futures on ever wilder schemes, was already looking for the door. That divergence would not remain philosophical. Soon, it would decide who walked away from the gang's final stand, and who stayed behind when Dutch's last plan came due. That divergence hardened in the weeks before Blackwater. When Dutch's grand philosophy finally collided with the simple question no one could escape anymore, how much longer could this outlaw family outrun a world that had already decided it was done with them? The gang was tired. They had been pushed from camp to camp, from its humble beginnings in scrappy hideouts to more elaborate setups that never lasted. The Pinkertons were closing in, the newspapers were full of their names, and the telegraph wires humming over new railroads carried their descriptions farther than any horse could run. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying. For men who had built their dreams on open horizons and slow news, that realization was a noose tightening around every campfire. Into that pressure stepped Dutch's answer: Blackwater. A ferry job, a mountain of cash, just one more score to buy passage to some imagined freedom across the ocean. It sounded, in the truest sense, like the culmination of every speech he had ever given about escaping civilization. To Bill and Javier, to the younger and more desperate, it was salvation. To Hosea and Arthur, it was something else entirely. Hosea read the town the way he once read Marx in a crowded saloon. Too many lawmen, too many Pinkertons sniffing around, too much money in one place to stay quiet. He pressed Dutch in the shadows of camp, voice low but urgent, asking the questions Dutch no longer liked to hear. Who were the partners? Who was providing the tip? What guarantees did they really have? Dutch answered with abstractions and reassurances, not details. Hosea saw the gap, and for the first time his loyalty sounded tired. Arthur felt it too. He had watched Dutch grow more secretive, more willing to gamble on strangers who flattered his ego. This plan depended on information from men the gang barely knew, on timing they did not control. In a town crawling with the very civilization Dutch claimed to despise, Arthur voiced his doubts, blunt and practical, pointing out logistics, escape routes, the sheer number of rifles that could be turned against them. Dutch met those concerns not with counter-arguments, but with sermons. He spoke of destiny, of faith, of family. He reminded the camp of every narrow escape, every time belief in him had paid off. Anyone who hesitated was not cautious, but cowardly, not thoughtful, but disloyal. In those moments, Dutch became the living embodiment of his own legend, using it as a weapon. Questioning the plan meant questioning the man, and that was a line fewer and fewer dared to cross. John stood on that line. On one side was the promise of enough money to disappear with Abigail and Jack, to finally give his son a life beyond tents and gunfire. On the other was the instinct that this town, this ferry, this moment felt wrong. His hesitations, his absences, his refusal to throw himself into Dutch's vision as completely as before would later be recast as betrayal. The seeds of that rift were sown here, in glances across the fire and in silences that lasted too long. Blackwater would later be remembered as a sudden catastrophe, a massacre that shattered the gang overnight. But in truth, it was the end of a long pattern, a story of warnings ignored and counsel dismissed. Dutch had been turning away from Hosea's caution and Arthur's grounded sense of the world for years. It was already written. The gang was only walking toward the page. When the night finally came, it did not feel like the beginning of a disaster. It felt to the gang like the payoff to years of hunger and hardship, a story of risk and reward in the truest sense. Blackwater was wealthy, the ferry was loaded, and Dutch promised that this one score would buy their freedom from the noose tightening around the Old West. From its humble beginnings, the Vanderlinde Gang had robbed banks, trains, and stagecoaches, but this was different. This was civilization itself, floating on lantern-lit water, businessmen, bonds, cash boxes, and the illusion of safety. Dutch spoke of it as a philosophy made real, stealing from the rich world that had never given them a chance. Hosea was cautious, Arthur uneasy, yet Dutch's confidence smothered doubt. He told them the town was watchful, yes, but manageable. He did not tell them what he had already heard. Days before the robbery, Pinkerton agents had been spotted asking questions in Blackwater, moving with the quiet assurance of men who already knew a name. Dutch had received word from a back-channel contact, a nervous intermediary who hinted that the ferry might be bait, that the town was hotter than it looked. Dutch listened, weighed it, and then buried it. If the gang sensed real danger, the plan might fracture. His dream could not afford hesitation. So the gang went in believing they were ghosts in the night. At first, the robbery unfolded with almost mechanical precision. Guns drawn, orders shouted, passengers terrified but compliant. Then the pattern broke. Lawmen appeared too fast, too many, rifles already raised. Pinkertons surged from the shadows as if they had rehearsed the scene. In moments, the ferry became a killing ground. Civilians screamed and scattered, some caught instantly in the crossfire that Dutch had sworn to avoid. A guard went down, then a bystander, then one of their own. This was the moment when Dutch could have called for retreat, could have cut the line and vanished into the dark. Instead, he escalated. He fired back, shouted to hold the deck, to push through, to take what they had come for. The water reflected muzzle flashes and falling bodies. Their name, once the living embodiment of outlaw romance, was soaked in blood that no speech could wash away. The escape was not a victory, it was flight. The gang scattered into the night, leaving bodies, money, and pieces of themselves behind. They reached the mountains half broke, shivering in Coulter's frozen wind, haunted by the images of Blackwater's dead. Some whispered that the plan had been bad, that the town had felt wrong from the very beginning. Dutch silenced such talk with a new story. He spoke of betrayal, of unseen enemies, of Pinkertons tipped off by traitors and cowards. He did not speak of the warnings he had ignored. In that silence lay the deeper failure, not tactical, but moral, and that refusal to accept blame would become the quiet fracture running through the gang's heart, a crack that the next secret would only widen. That crack runs straight into the mountains. The roar of Blackwater is replaced by something worse: silence. Snow smothers the world, swallowing color, sound, even the memory of warmth. The gang staggers into Coulter, half-starved and half-frozen. A story of freedom reduced to men and women huddled around weak fires, coughing in the dark. From its humble beginnings in dusty saloons and sunlit plains, the Vanderlinde family now survives on frozen air and whatever can be stolen from the dead. The camp is no longer a bustling little civilization with music, chores, and easy laughter. It is a cave with a few lanterns, a handful of blankets, and too many ghosts. Children shiver under threadbare coats. Horses stand with heads bowed, ribs showing. Every breath hangs in the air like a question. How much farther can this dream be pushed before it breaks? In this frozen limbo, Dutch tries to answer that question before anyone dares to ask it aloud. He walks the cramped rooms and snow-choked paths with a blanket over his shoulders, pulling it tighter around the weakest, pressing hands to foreheads, promising that this is only a trial. He speaks softly to Abigail, to Tilly, to the sick. He calls them family in the truest sense, the living embodiment of his philosophy that no one gets left behind. But the tenderness has edges. The moment someone wonders if Blackwater was a mistake, his voice turns sharp, his eyes flash. He snaps at Bill for complaining about food, snarls at Javier for mentioning Hosea's doubts, stares down Arthur when the questions get too close to the very beginning of the disaster. In Dutch's new story, the snow is not a consequence of his failure. It is proof that fate is testing them, that the world was changing, and oh man, wounded, unarmed, half buried in a drift. The boy begs, insists he knows nothing, that he is no threat. For a heartbeat, Arthur hesitates. The old Dutch might have turned this into a speech about mercy and message, about showing they are better than the men who hunt them. Instead, Dutch raises his pistol and fires. One shot. Red on white. He calls it necessary, calls it protection, calls it survival. Who can risk an informant stumbling back to campfires the gang cannot see? Arthur drags the body through the snow and feels a deep unease he cannot yet name. It is not the killing. He has killed before. It is the way Dutch does not look away, the way the justification comes faster than the gunshot. Here, with no music, no whiskey glow, only wind clawing at the walls, Dutch's rhetoric starts to sound thin. The old ways were dying out there in the blizzard, and something colder was taking their place. Faced with the chance to admit Blackwater was his fault, Dutch makes an unspoken choice. He will not bend. He will not confess. He will become the only thing standing between his family and annihilation, even if that annihilation walks on his own 2 feet. When the walls finally close in at St. Denis, they do not crack so much as explode. Hosea is gunned down in the square. Lenny dies on a rooftop, and Dutch's grand plan, the one that was supposed to save them all, ends in smoke, blood, and sirens. In the chaos that follows, the gang does not ride to freedom. It is scattered into exile. The escape that carries Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and a few others out of the city is not a daring outlaw triumph, but a desperate flight onto a stolen boat. A storm tears that last illusion apart. Thrown overboard and washed ashore on Guarma, they awaken not in the familiar American frontier, but in a humid, brutal world that feels torn from someone else's nightmare. The world was changing back home. Here, it seems frozen in an older cruelty. From the very beginning, Dutch refuses to see Guarma as a dead end. He frames it as providence, a strange kind of opportunity. Here, the enemy is obvious. Wealthy colonial sugar barons, private armies in pristine uniforms, a plantation regime that is the living embodiment of everything he claims to hate. For a man who has always needed his story of resistance and civilization and conflict, Guarma looks, at first, almost perfect. Yet the island is a mirror that shows the gang what they truly are. They are not revolutionaries. They are exhausted fugitives, half-starved, half-drowned, armed with borrowed rifles and borrowed causes. To survive, they throw in with local rebels whose language, history, and suffering they barely understand. Dutch begins making promises in the truest sense he cannot keep. Weapons, victories, a future beyond the plantations. Each pledge is grander than the last. Each one costs someone else's blood. In this tropical prison, the illusions that once held the gang together begin to peel away. The campfire stories about freedom and family sound thin when everyone is a pawn in someone else's civil war. Dutch's philosophy, from its humble beginnings as a railing against railroads and bankers, now mutates into something harsher. Every setback is betrayal. Every delay is sabotage. When an ally hesitates, Dutch sees a traitor. When a plan falters, he blames spies and cowards, never himself. Paranoia and grandiosity grow side by side. A small victory against the plantation guards convinces Dutch that destiny still rides with him. A single ambush gone wrong convinces him that even Arthur might be turning. How could loyalty survive in a world where Dutch has decided that doubt itself is treason? By the time the survivors claw their way back to the mainland, the exile is no longer only physical. Dutch has crossed a private border in his own mind. He returns not as the man who left St. Denis, but as a leader who has learned to rewrite reality to protect his pride. And from here on, some of his most dangerous secrets are not the ones he hides from his family, but the ones he hides from himself. And nowhere is that new Dutch more exposed than in St. Denis, in the candlelit salons and rotting back alleys ruled by Angelo Bronte. Bronte is the living embodiment of everything Dutch claims to fight, a refined, ruthless crime lord who wears civilization like a tailored suit, while his hands stay busy in blood and mud. From the very beginning, Bronte stands as a mirror held up to Dutch's philosophy. Here's an outlaw who never fled into the woods, who did not build a wandering family camp from its humble beginnings, but instead carved out a throne in the heart of the modern world. He dines with mayors, bribes police, and walks past Pinkertons with a smile. He proves that in a city where the old ways were dying, violence has not vanished. It has simply learned to read, to dress well, to shake hands in public. Dutch walks into that orbit outwardly as a businessman, offering partnership in profit. Internally, though, Bronte is a challenge, almost an insult. How can this immigrant crime lord sit at the table of power while Dutch, the self-proclaimed prophet of freedom, hides in swamps and burned-out mansions? In the truest sense, Dutch does not only want Bronte's money. He wants to outthink him, to expose him, to prove that the Vanderlinde way still matters in a world racing toward banks and telegraphs, so he lies by omission. To the gang, the Bronte arrangement is presented as a simple opportunity, a stepping stone toward one last score and a ticket out. Dutch talks about introductions, about doors opening, about a rich city ready to be plucked. He does not dwell on the truth, that Bronte is entangled with judges, police, and industrialists. That crossing him is not just a criminal risk, but a political one. How many in camp truly understand that they are now playing in a world where a single dinner conversation can seal their fate? Bronte understands Dutch far better than Dutch understands Bronte. He flatters Dutch's intellect, praises his ideals, and speaks to his sense of grievance against civilization's hypocrisy. He tells Dutch he is different from the other outlaws, that his dreams are grander, that St. Denis deserves to be humbled. Each compliment is a hook, each favor, a leash. Bronte nudges him toward bolder, more reckless moves, all while keeping the real balance of power hidden behind polite smiles and armed servants. Two men meet, each thinking he is robbing the other. Only one is standing on home ground. When Bronte arranges Jack's return, when he escorts the gang through opulent gardens and into the heart of the city's elite, Dutch convinces himself he is the one using Bronte. But this alliance is a story of slow betrayal, of dreams curdling into delusions. The night Dutch finally turns on Angelo Bronte, dragging him from his mansion to a muddy, moonlit shore, will not be a clean act of justice. It will be the moment his rage and pride drown his principles, and the gang crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. What exactly does Dutch do there, and how does that single act poison everything that follows? It begins in the rain. Not with a grand speech or a noble stand, but with carriage wheels hissing over flooded cobblestones as Dutch rides into Angelo Bronte's district. The world narrowed to gas lamps, thunder, and the promise of retribution. St. Denis, that monument to civilization, is drowning in its own storm. The canals churn black beneath the moon, and the mansions along the boulevard glow warm and golden, untouched by the mud where the gang usually walks. Dutch has told them this is justice for Jack, justice for betrayal, another chapter in a story of the rich preying on the poor. Yet even before the first doors kicked in, something in his eyes says this night is about him. They breach Bronte's mansion in a flash of gunfire and shouted orders. Velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, a piano frozen mid-song, all the trappings of power are ripped open by wet boots and drawn guns. Bronte is dragged from his seat of luxury in his dressing gown, forced down marble steps and out into the storm, his slippers slipping in the mud as the men he once used as tools now haul him toward the waiting boat. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's crusade against civilization has led him here, kidnapping a city's king under the cover of thunder. On the ride through the canals, the pattern breaks. The prisoner does not beg. He laughs. Bound and beaten, rain streaming through his mustache, Bronte studies Dutch as though examining a specimen. He calls him a hypocrite, a self-styled philosopher who dresses greed in poetry, an outlaw who speaks of freedom but dreams only of being the living embodiment of the power he claims to hate. Is that not what Dutch has become, a man who wants the mansions as much as he wants to burn them? Dutch could have disproved him with restraint. He does not. Something snaps behind his eyes. On that muddy, moonlit shore, with the gang circled in a ragged half-ring, he shoves Bronte's head into the canal. Once, again, each time the man surfaces, choking, he spits more venom, calling out Dutch's vanity, his delusions, his need to be adored. Dutch does not simply silence him, he savors it. The old ways were dying, and with them went the last thin line between necessity and cruelty. Arthur, Javier, Bill, even Micah fall into a horrified silence. This is not a gunfight gone wrong or a desperate escape. This is execution, in the truest sense, born from wounded pride. When Bronte finally goes still, Dutch hauls the body up, breath ragged, and immediately wraps the act in language. It had to be done. The man was a snake. This was for the family. Who will challenge him now, soaked in blood and rain, when loyalty and fear are suddenly the same thing? From that night on, Dutch's secrets are no longer just about hidden money or quiet deals with men like Bronte. They include the man he has become, the lost soul beneath the speeches, the side of himself he cannot afford to let his family fully see. The gang will tell themselves it was a necessary evil, that this is still a story of freedom against a corrupt world. But something has shifted. If Dutch can drown a city's king for wounding his pride, what might he do to his own when they threaten his myth? That question will hang over every plan, every promise, as the gang stumbles toward its end. That question will not hang for long. Because the one man who used to answer it, who used to pull Dutch back from the edge, is about to be silenced. From the very beginning, Hosea Matthews had been Dutch's counterweight. If Dutch was the fire, Hosea was the hand on the bellows, feeding it but never letting it rage out of control. He understood Dutch's philosophy, shared the dream of freedom from a corrupt civilization, yet he also knew the limits, the lines that could not be crossed without turning an idealistic rebellion into just another outlaw gang. Dutch could rage at Bill, dismiss Javier, snap at Arthur, But when Hosea spoke, he listened. For years, that unspoken rule kept the gang balanced. Hosea could call a plan foolish without being branded a traitor, could name Dutch's delusions for what they were and still be welcomed by the fire at night. It was a story of partnership in the truest sense. Two aging con men holding each other's worst impulses in check while raising a family of lost souls on the run from a changing world. By the time the gang reaches Saint Denis, that balance is failing. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch was changing faster than either of them wanted to admit. Hosea watches him grow more secretive, more volatile, more willing to trust flattering strangers over loyal friends. Bronte, Cornwall, even the whispers around Micah, Dutch keeps more and more behind closed doors, snapping when pressed, promising that it is all part of the plan. Hosea hears the tone, sees the temper. He has seen Dutch obsessed before, but never this proud, never this brittle. In the weeks before the bank job, Hosea makes his last stand the only way he knows how, through quiet, persistent resistance. He pushes for smaller, safer scores, for slipping away while St. Denis is still just a place to pass through, rather than a stage for some grand gesture. He corners Dutch in private, arguing that their family is tired, that the Pinkertons are closing in, that dreams mean nothing if everyone dies chasing them. Dutch smiles, flatters, reassures, and ignores him. So Hosea turns to Arthur, the living embodiment of their shared project. He urges him to keep an eye on Dutch, to question more, to think for himself when Hosea cannot be there. It is a subtle handoff, from its humble beginnings as two men against the world, to an aging mentor trying to save what little remains. Then the bank doors blow open, and everything ends. Hosea is taken outside, used as leverage, executed in the street, while Dutch watches helplessly from inside the vault. The shot that kills Hosea does more than end a life. It erases the last real check on Dutch's power, the only witness who knew every version of their story and could still see through the lies Dutch told others and himself. In the chaos that follows, the gang loses a father, but Dutch loses something even more dangerous: contradiction. With Hosea gone, there is no one left who can look him in the eye and say, "That's not how it happened." Dutch is suddenly free to rewrite their history, to turn compromises into principles and betrayals into necessary sacrifices. And as he does, isolated inside his own narrative, another question rises. Without Hosea's voice in his ear, how far will Dutch go to protect the myth of Dutch Vanderlinde? Without Hosea's steady hand, Dutch's world does not simply grow quieter. It becomes an echo chamber. Into that hollow space, into that grief and wounded pride, steps the man who will be the living embodiment of Dutch's worst impulses, Micah Bell. Micah does not come from the very beginning. He is not a Coulter veteran, not a man who bled with them through Blackwater and the blizzards. He drifts in later, a volatile, sadistic outlaw with a trail of burned bridges behind him, whispered tales of botched jobs, dead partners, and convenient disappearances. Men who rode with Micah have a habit of ending up in shallow graves or jail cells. And those patterns are not accidents. They are a story of betrayal turned into a survival strategy. Under any other circumstances, Dutch would have seen it. Once, from its humble beginnings, his philosophy demanded that knew and sees only what he wants to see. A fearless gun, a man who never flinches, a voice that never questions. In a time when the old ways were dying and the gang's faith is wavering, Micah sells Dutch a simple picture. Everyone else is losing their nerve. Only Dutch and Micah still understand the dream. Micah understands the transaction in the truest sense. He offers absolute deference in public, calling Dutch boss and genius, praising every scheme as visionary, no matter how reckless. When Arthur raises doubts, when John talks about leaving for his family, Micah is there to sneer that they are going soft, that civilization has rotted their courage. Dutch, already nursing the idea that he has been betrayed by cowards, drinks it in. It confirms the story he needs to tell himself to keep moving. Very quickly, Micah stops being just another gun. He becomes the man at Dutch's shoulder. Around the campfire, others notice the pattern. Dutch and Micah slipping away to talk in low voices. Plans changing overnight with no explanation. Routes altered, risks increased. A robbery that was meant to be clean turns into a massacre after one of those whispered counsels. And no one can quite say why. Who suggested the new route? Who decided more bodies were acceptable collateral? The gang, once built on open debate and shared philosophy, starts to feel ruled by a shadow council of two. Arthur and the others are left chasing orders, not understanding the reasoning, only the blood that follows. Questions multiply. Answers shrink. What makes Micah truly dangerous is not only that he feeds Dutch's paranoia, but that he listens while he flatters. In those private talks, Dutch vents old grudges, half-confessed secrets, hidden deals, and hidden money. Micah learns where the bodies are buried, both literal and figurative. And as the noose tightens, as the dream curdles into delusions, one chilling possibility hangs over the camp. What happens when the man who knows Dutch's darkest secrets decides it is time to cash them in? Those secrets do not stay buried. They leak out in arguments, in missing dollars, in the hollow ring of the word plan. And one night at Beaver Hollow, after yet another bloody failure, they finally catch fire. The camp is exhausted. Rain has turned the clearing to black mud, the trees press in like a jury, and the central fire burns low, more ember than flame. A job that was meant to save them has left more bodies in the dirt, more names added to a story of freedom turned nightmare. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the Vanderlinde Gang looks less like a family and more like refugees from their own dreams. Arthur stands near the fire, coat still spattered with someone else's blood. His lungs rattle, his patience gone. Dutch paces in the glow, Micah slouched on a crate nearby, smug and watchful. Around them, the others hover at the edge of the light, half in shadow, half in denial. Arthur breaks first. His voice cuts through the crackle of the fire, low but unshakable. He demands to know what the plan is now, not in poetry, but in numbers. Where is the money from Blackwater? From Saint Denis? From all those hidden deals Dutch swore would buy their freedom? Why is Micah's word worth more than Hosea's memory? More than the loyalty of those who bled for this philosophy from the very beginning? Dutch does not answer with facts. He answers with outrage. His shoulders stiffen, his eyes flash, and he accuses Arthur of betrayal, of losing faith, of failing to understand that a great vision demands sacrifice. In the truest sense, Dutch paints himself as the wounded prophet, misunderstood by his own disciples, cornered by civilization, and hunted by cowards. Micah seizes the moment. He calls Arthur weak, old, sick, a lost soul who no longer believes. He sneers that men who question in the dark will hang in the daylight. His words are poison, but they are simple, and in a tired camp, simple sounds safe. The reaction is not loud at first. It is physical. Bill and Javier drift closer to Dutch and Micah, faces hard, hands near their guns. Pearson and Strauss linger behind them, drawn by habit and fear. On the other side, John edges toward Arthur, Karen and Tilly watching with wide, uncertain eyes. Charles stands between the groups, jaw clenched, already choosing without speaking. Glances travel faster than bullets. Sadie's stare finds Dutch, then Arthur, measuring which man still resembles the living embodiment of the cause she joined. Abigail clutches Jack, standing just outside the circle, seeing a family split in two around a fire that once meant safety. For a brief, silent moment, it almost feels absurd. An outlaw family meeting on the brink of annihilation, arguing over a plan no one has ever seen, over money no one has ever touched. But the absurdity only makes the fracture sharper. This is not one argument, it is every secret Dutch ever kept, finally demanding payment. The camp does not explode that night. It does something worse. It divides and stays divided, the rift running straight through the firelight, straight through Dutch's authority. And from that point on, every order, every promise, every whispered plan is heard through that crack, as the buried landmine of Dutch's lies ticks louder beneath their feet. The crack in the camp becomes a crack in Arthur. It just takes his body failing for his mind to finally follow. By Beaver Hollow, the cough is no longer an inconvenience, it is a sentence. Tuberculosis turns every ride into a trial, every breath into a reminder that his time in this world is running out. That looming end forces a distance he has never had before. Dutch's speeches, once the living embodiment of hope and defiance, begin to sound thin, echoing off the walls of a man who can no longer afford delusions. Illness makes Arthur watch instead of rush. He sees the way Dutch scans the camp, not as a father guarding his family, but as a general measuring expendable pieces on a board. From its humble beginnings, the gang had been sold as a story of freedom and loyalty, of outlaws standing together against civilization's hypocrisy. Now, Arthur notices who gets protected and who gets abandoned. Saint Denis is the first unforgivable fracture. During the bank heist, when the law closes in and the plan collapses, Dutch does not go back for John. He orders a retreat, leaves John to be captured, and later papers it over as necessity. Hosea and Lenny die for that same plan. Dutch mourns them loudly but never questions himself. For Arthur, already sick, already tired, that choice festers. What is loyalty worth if it ends the moment loyalty becomes inconvenient? Then come the smaller, crueler decisions. Strauss's debtors broken and ruined, towns burned for cover, innocence dismissed as collateral in a philosophy that once claimed to protect the weak. Each step confirms what Arthur's lungs have been telling him. The old ways were dying, but Dutch is killing them faster. The real breaking point arrives with Abigail. When she is taken and the gang begs Dutch to act, he hesitates, deflects, refuses to risk his new golden boy Micah or his latest plan. The man who once swore that the gang was his only family now weighs Abigail's life against his pride. Arthur sees it in his eyes. Dutch is not afraid of losing them. He is afraid of being proven wrong. So Arthur confronts him, not just about tactics, but about the lies that have been rotting the gang from the very beginning. The hidden money in Blackwater, the secret talks with men like Angelo Bronte, the way Dutch rewrites every disaster as martyrdom, casting himself as victim of a changing world instead of architect of their downfall. How many times has he said, "Trust me," while keeping the truth locked away? In the truest sense, this is Arthur's revelation. Dutch's dream is no longer a dream at all, just a shield for ego and paranoia. Seeing it is liberation. Knowing it comes too late is tragedy. Arthur understands that his own story, and perhaps the gang's, has already crossed the point of no return, and the next choice he makes may be the last one that still matters. Arthur's revelation cracks the illusion. John's decision shatters it. If Arthur is the conscience finally waking up, John is the consequence that Dutch never truly believed would arrive, a son who chooses a different kind of family. From the very beginning, John's loyalty has been tested in blood and abandonment. He is left half dead after being shot during the Blackwater escape, dragged off by the current of chaos while Dutch and the others flee into the snow. Later, in the mountains and beyond, Dutch speaks of him as if he is already gone. It is not the first time John has been lost, but it is the first time he understands that being lost suits Dutch's philosophy more than being protected. These near-death moments are not just accidents of an outlaw's life. They are a story of who is worth saving when the bullets start flying. Dutch charges back into danger for money, for pride, for a grand gesture that proves he still controls the world around him. For John, in those crucial hours, there is only silence. The message is brutal in its simplicity. His loyalty is expendable. When John returns, scarred and bitter, something in him has shifted. The camp that once felt like freedom now feels precarious, almost theatrical, a stage for Dutch's speeches rather than a home. Abigail's frustration, Jack's fear, the way the boy clings to his father after kidnappings and gunfights, these are no longer inconveniences to John. They are his responsibility. In the truest sense, they are his small, fragile future, the one thing in this collapsing world that is not built on robbery and delusions. He begins to see the contrast with painful clarity. Dutch talks about civilization crushing the old ways, about the world changing and the old ways were dying, but every new plan demands that John put his son on the altar. Every new escape route runs straight through Abigail's tears. How long can a man claim to fight for freedom while sacrificing his own family's chance at a quiet, honest life? So John does something unthinkable in a gang built on absolute loyalty. He talks about leaving. He pulls Arthur aside at Horseshoe Overlook, at Clemens Point, at Beaver Hollow, in those rare moments between jobs when the campfire burns low. He argues that the gang is no longer a family, just a sinking ship captained by a madman who cannot admit the water is already at their throats. He urges Arthur, and sometimes others, to imagine another ending, ranch work, a small house, Jack chasing fireflies instead of gunsmoke. Arthur listens, torn between the man who raised him and the man who mirrors his own doubts. Their conversations become the living embodiment of the gang's fracture, two brothers standing at a crossroads, one still half chained to Dutch's dream, the other already stepping away from it. Each argument is both plea and accusation. Why stay for a leader who leaves his sons to die? Why die for a philosophy that no longer believes in them? Dutch's reaction is swift and venomous. To him, John's doubts are not the natural consequence of broken promises, they are betrayal made flesh. He brands John a traitor, a coward, a man running from the fight just when the world is closing in. In Dutch's mind, John's attempt to save his family becomes further proof that everyone leaves him in the end, that the world is full of deserters who do not understand his grand design. Micah, ever eager to poison the well, amplifies this paranoia, whispering that John is weak, that John talks to the law, that John's love for Abigail and Jack is a liability. Dutch listens, because it confirms what he already fears. The man who once saved John from a noose now rewrites him as an enemy. Yet beneath the accusations and the shouting, something else is happening, something Dutch cannot control. John's survival instinct, sharpened by bullets and cold nights alone, is finally pointed away from Dutch and toward his own blood. He starts hiding money, planning routes, imagining a future without the gang's banner over his head. It is a quiet rebellion against the secrets that have governed his life. In that choice lies a different kind of courage, not the courage to charge a bank in Saint Denis, but the courage to walk away from the only family he has ever known, because that family has forgotten what the word means. John chooses Abigail and Jack over abstract freedom, real responsibility over romantic outlaw rhetoric. He chooses a small, uncertain life over a grand, suicidal gesture, and in doing so, he does something no one else has truly done. He breaks free of Dutch's secrets. The hidden deals, the lies about money, the unspoken hierarchy that kept everyone orbiting Dutch's ego, John steps outside their gravity. His survival into Red Dead Redemption, his eventual role as a reluctant instrument of the very civilization Dutch despised, is only possible because he walks away. That raises a haunting question the gang never gets to answer. If John's escape opens the door to another fate, how many others might have lived if they had found the strength to do the same? And what buried truth will finally force the last of them to choose between Dutch's dream and their own lives? That unanswered question hangs over the camp like smoke, and in its shadow the real endings begin, not with gunfire, but with conversations no one dares to name as farewells. One evening, Arthur sits across from Tilly at the edge of the firelight, a tin cup of watered-down whiskey between them. The camp is quieter than it has any right to be. Tilly talks about the next town and the next train, tracing futures in the dirt with a stick, but her voice keeps catching on the word next. Arthur watches her, hearing the tremor she tries to hide, and offers the only thing he has left, a rough apology for ever dragging her into this world, and a gruff promise that she deserves better than Dutch's philosophy of endless flight. She smiles, but it is the smile of someone already halfway gone. Elsewhere, a different ritual plays out. Bill and Javier trade a joke about Micah's smell and Dutch's speeches, a familiar rhythm that once could send the whole camp laughing. This time, the punchline lands heavy. The laughter is too short, too thin, and dies before it reaches the wagons. Bill forces another chuckle. They both know the old ways were dying, long before the Pinkertons ever rode in. Near one of the wagons, Karen quietly folds what little she owns into a worn satchel. No dramatic declarations, no final outburst, just clothes, a bottle, a pistol, all disappearing into canvas. She mutters something about when we move camp, yet she checks the weight of that bag the way a person checks the weight of a life they might have to carry alone. Arthur pauses in the shadows, watching, wanting to say something that could pull her back from the edge. Nothing comes. What words could fix a story of freedom that turned into a cage? In these small scenes, Arthur reaches for peace in the only currency he has left: small kindnesses and unfinished sentences. A hand on Charles's shoulder as he sharpens his knife, a quiet, "you did right," that Charles understands is more than praise. A word to Sadie about finding her own war to fight, not Dutch's. He tells John, almost casually, to hold on to Abigail and Jack, to remember there is a world beyond wanted posters and half-buried money. None of them say goodbye. Every one of them hears it. Around them, denial becomes the camp's last shared religion. They speak of the next camp, the next plan, the next miracle that will wipe away Blackwater, Saint Denis, Guarma. Yet every time Dutch says he has a plan, more eyes drop to the ground. The living embodiment of their dream is now a man they no longer fully trust, and that betrayal sits in the silence between every sentence. One night, as the fire burns low and the voices fade, Arthur stands alone and looks around the camp. From its humble beginnings, this was never just a gang to him. It was, in the truest sense, a family built on promises of a better world. Now he sees the truth with painful clarity. Not outlaws chasing freedom, but tired men and women clinging to a dream Dutch could never keep. Each one a lost soul waiting for the moment everything finally breaks. Arthur sees it first in the way the camp goes quiet. Not peaceful, but hollow. What was once the living embodiment of Dutch's dream of freedom and family becomes a place of whispers, side glances, and hands never far from holsters. At Beaver Hollow, the air itself feels wrong. Men who once sang around the fire now talk in corners, voices low, eyes flicking toward the trees and then back toward Dutch's tent. They watch for Pinkertons, for O'Driscolls, for lawmen hunting the last outlaw gang of the age. But more than that, they watch each other. Every absence is suspicious, every private conversation a potential betrayal. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the gang can feel it pressing in from the dark woods around them. At the center of that darkness stands Dutch unraveling. One day he talks about Tahiti, the next about hitting Cornwall's men again, the next about disappearing into the mountains. Plans change by the hour, promises shift by the minute. He strides through camp delivering speeches about loyalty and philosophy, then retreats to his tent and slams the flap shut, leaving only one man invited inside, Micah Bell. Those private conferences become the new heartbeat of the gang, a sickly, irregular rhythm. Hosea is gone, Lenny is gone, and the old balance is gone with them. Where once Dutch argued with Hosea, listened to Arthur, weighed Charles or Sadie's counsel, he now lets Micah drip poison into his ear. Micah flatters him, echoes his rhetoric about civilization crushing them, feeds him names when he needs someone to blame, and Dutch, who once prided himself on seeing through every con, becomes the easiest mark of all. The shift is clearest in the accusations. When supplies go missing or a patrol gets too close, Micah is ready with an answer. Maybe Arthur is getting soft. Maybe John is planning to run. Maybe there's a traitor in their midst. The stories are thin, full of holes, but Dutch clings to them because the alternative is unbearable. If Micah is wrong, then the failure is his. So he believes. He believes when Micah calls Arthur disloyal. He believes when Micah insists John abandon the family. He even believes that the Pinkertons always know where they are because someone in camp is talking, not because his own plans have become reckless and predictable. Underneath it all lie Dutch's secrets. Stacked higher than the money he keeps promising is still out there. The Blackwater cash, hidden and half-mythical. Quiet deals with men like Angelo Bronte and the Braithwaites, never fully explained. Half-truths about who was told what and when and why. From the very beginning he preached equality, but he always hoarded information. No one knows if the next job is a path to freedom or a march into a grave. How can a gang move as one when every man suspects the other? How can a family survive when its father is hiding not just plans but doubts? Beaver Hollow becomes a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions grinding against each other in the mud. The camp is no longer a refuge, it is a pressure cooker. And all that pressure has to go somewhere. It will not release in a quiet conversation or a clean break. It will explode high on a mountainside, where every whispered suspicion and every buried secret finally comes roaring into the open with guns drawn and years of rage behind every shot. The pressure does not just explode, it focuses, hard and cold, into the barrel of a gun. All the whispered doubts and buried secrets of the Vanderlinde Gang narrow into one brutal question. Who betrayed this family? Arthur has the answer now. From its humble beginnings, the gang had always feared the noose and the badge, but the real noose was tied from within. In the mud and sickness of Beaver Hollow, Arthur stumbles onto the truth that has been rotting the gang from the very beginning. Micah Bell, the swaggering latecomer who flatters Dutch's every word, has been feeding the Pinkertons information since the chaos of Blackwater. The raids that come too fast, the ambushes that feel too precise, the way Milton always seems one step ahead. None of it is coincidence. It is cooperation. Arthur tries to drag that cooperation into the light. He confronts Dutch in the caves, in the camp, in any moment when Dutch's mask slips. He points to Micah's sudden wealth, his secret meetings, his eagerness to push the gang into bloodier, louder crimes just as the noose tightens. Yet every accusation runs into the same wall: Micah's talent for turning truth inside out. The informant calls Arthur the traitor. The dying outlaw is painted as the living embodiment of disloyalty. Micah frames Arthur's doubts as poison, his compassion as weakness, his illness as proof that he has already abandoned the dream. Who questions Dutch? A friend or an enemy? In a world where the old ways were dying, Dutch chooses the answer that hurts the least. The final reckoning comes high on that storm-scarred mountainside. Snow, rock, smoke, and the last remnants of an unkidealistic family scattered across the ridge. Guns are drawn, voices crack. Arthur stands with John's escape fresh in his mind, with the memory of Hosea's warnings in his ears, and calls Micah what he is, a Pinkerton rat. Micah laughs, of course. Two men, both armed, both filthy, both insisting the other is the traitor. It would almost be ironic if it were not fatal. All eyes turn to Dutch. This is more than a choice between two gunmen. It is a choice between two philosophies, between dreams and delusions, between the son who grew with him and the disciple who tells him that none of this is his fault. Dutch hesitates. The man who once preached freedom and family cannot decide which family to save. In the truest sense, his paralysis is the answer. He does not lower his gun in defense of Arthur. He does not raise it against Micah. He simply steps back, turns away, and walks into the fogged air, choosing his own image over his oldest son. By refusing to choose, he condemns Arthur, the shots, the struggle, the final fate of the gang's most loyal, lost soul. All of it unfolds as Dutch's silhouette fades into the smoke, a father vanishing into the mountain while his abandoned child faces the gunpoint truth alone. Arthur's last moments do not explode out of nowhere. They are the slow, inevitable collision of every compromise, every wound, every secret that has been festering since the very beginning. On that mountainside, in the thin air above Beaver Hollow, the story of the Vanderlinde Gang narrows to a single, gasping man who can barely stand and yet refuses to kneel. His body is failing. Tuberculosis has turned his lungs into open wounds. Every breath a reminder that the old ways were dying inside him, long before the bullets started flying. Yet he still drags himself through the rocks, trading shots with Pinkertons, shielding John's escape, and finally clawing his way into that desperate brawl with Micah. It is not just a fight between two outlaws. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a man who once broke jaws for Dutch's philosophy now swinging his fists to expose Dutch's lies. Micah sneers that Arthur is the traitor, the one who turned on his family. The irony is brutal. Arthur, the living embodiment of Dutch's code for so many years, now dies trying to break that code open and show what rots beneath it. In those last blows, in those last words to John, he is not defending Dutch's dream of freedom from civilization. He is trying to save one small family from the dream itself. He sends John down the mountain, toward Abigail and Jack, toward a chance at a different world where Dutch's name is a warning, not a banner. When Arthur finally collapses, whether under Micah's knife, Micah's bullet, or simply the weight of his own ruined lungs, the tragedy is complete. He does not die for the gang. He dies in spite of it. In the truest sense, his final act is a whistle blown with blood instead of breath, a last refusal to let Dutch's legend swallow John whole. How many outlaws in that dying West ever got the chance to turn their own ending into someone else's beginning? Around him, the gang shatters for good. Some fall in the last chaotic shootouts. Nameless bodies in the snow and mud as Pinkertons close in. Others scatter into the wilderness, riding hard and not looking back, each one clutching a different version of what happened on that mountain. To Bill, to Javier, to those who still need a father to believe in, Arthur is the traitor. To Sadie and Charles, he is the last honest man. To the Pinkertons, he is just another outlaw statistic as the world was changing. And Dutch simply vanishes. No confession, no apology, no grave. From its humble beginnings, this wandering philosopher demanded loyalty in exchange for meaning. In the end, he gives nothing back. He slips into rumor and half-remembered sightings, a shadow in border towns, a name spoken with anger or awe depending on who survived him. Was he a revolutionary crushed by civilization, or a conman who believed his own sermon? Years pass. The gang becomes a cautionary tale, a story told in saloons and Pinkerton briefings. John builds a ranch, raises a son, and tries to bury the mountain under chores and fences. Yet Dutch's secrets do not stay buried. On another peak, in another winter, those final bullets will echo again as Dutch, John, and a man named Marston face the ghosts Arthur left behind. The dream is dead, but its consequences are not. Dutch's story is not finished. Not yet. John Marston's new life begins with fences, not gunfire. After the mountain and the snow and Arthur's last ride, he tries to trade the roar of gunshots for the creak of a ranch gate, the chaos of camp for the steady rhythm of chores. It is, in the truest sense, an attempt to bury an entire world under mud, sweat, and silence. On Beecher's Hope, the outlaw becomes a husband and father again, or at least tries to. Dawn means milking, mending, breaking horses. Dusk means reading to Jack, arguing gently with Abigail, pretending that the name Dutch is just another ghost carried off on the wind. This is a story of a man trying to outrun his own legend, of freedom reduced to owning a small piece of land, of family rebuilt on ground still soaked in old blood. But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. Civilization does not forget its enemies, it files them. When the government agents come, they do not wear masks, they wear suits. Edgar Ross and his colleagues arrive not with wanted posters, but with a contract written in threats: hunt down the remnants of the Vanderlinde Gang, or lose the family that ranch was built to protect. Was this not the very system Dutch always ranted about? In a cruel irony, Dutch's philosophy becomes John's prison. The speeches about a rigged civilization, about men in offices deciding fates from behind desks, all crystallize into a single, undeniable reality: the state owns John's future. To save Abigail and Jack, he rides again into the outlaw world, tracking Bill in Mexico, Javier in the borderlands, following the fading footprints of the only family he ever knew, so that his new family can live. At the end of that trail waits Dutch. Older, thinner, more spectral than the man on the mountain, he now leads a ragged band of native followers in the high country, preaching the same ideals to a new audience: freedom, resistance, the cruelty of civilization. His philosophy has not changed, but his grip on reality has frayed. Is he a revolutionary, or just a lost soul hiding from time itself? The confrontation in the cliffside fort is a mirror held up to the very beginning. Once, Dutch stood between John and the world, promising a plan. Now, John stands between Dutch and the government, offering surrender. Dutch refuses. Surrounded, wounded, he looks at John with something between pity and pride and delivers his final, cryptic verdict on their long struggle: they cannot fight change, the world will move on without them. Then he steps back and falls. No confession, no account of the betrayals, no admission of Micah, Blackwater, or the quiet compromises that doomed them from the start. Even in death, Dutch protects the myth of Dutch. He leaves John and everyone watching to sift through ruins and rumors, piecing together the truth behind a man who was the living embodiment of both dream and delusion. And the cost of that myth is not paid in the past. It is coming due on John's doorstep next. But what if the myth cracked sooner? What if, instead of dying with his secrets, Dutch had laid them bare before his family from the very beginning? The central question hangs over the entire story of the Vanderlinde Gang. At what exact moment does Dutch stop believing his own ideals and start using them as a mask for ego and fear? Is it Blackwater, with bodies in the water and Pinkertons on the docks? Is it St. Denis, with Hosea's corpse on the cobblestones? Or did that fracture appear years earlier, hidden beneath polished speeches about freedom and civilization? From its humble beginnings, the gang grows around a philosophy that feels, in the truest sense, almost noble. Rob the rich. Protect the weak. Live free. Yet even before Arthur and John, Dutch and Hosea are already pulling cons that leave innocents dead, quietly rebranded as necessary sacrifices. Imagine Dutch admitting that to Arthur the first time he calls their band a family, confessing that the code is not pure, that blood was spilled for pride as much as principle. Would Arthur have followed so blindly, or would he have challenged the man he saw as a father? Consider Blackwater as a turning point reframed by honesty. Dutch knows the job is too big, the risks too high, the enemies too powerful. He withholds details about the money, the arrangements, the shadows moving against them. If, instead, he had sat Arthur and Hosea down and laid out every threat, every compromise, every uneasy deal, could that ferry robbery have been stopped before it began? Or would the gang, given the full truth, have walked away and survived as smaller outlaws rather than doomed legends? The pattern repeats in Saint Denis. Dutch secretly negotiates with Angelo Bronte, charmed by the crime lord's flattery, ignoring Hosea's quiet warnings. When Bronte betrays them, Dutch sells the story as one more step in a grand design. Imagine a different night on those flooded streets, where Dutch admits he is out of his depth in a world of bankers and politicians, where the old ways were dying and his philosophy no longer fits. Would Hosea have taken the reins? Would Arthur have dragged them out before the bank doors ever opened? Then comes Beaver Hollow, Micah whispering poison in Dutch's ear. Here the mask hardens into something else. If Dutch had confessed his fear of losing control, his terror that the gang no longer needed him, could Micah's influence have been broken by the very loyalty Dutch preached? How many deaths vanish in that alternate story? Sean in Rhodes, Lenny on the rooftops, Hosea in Saint Denis, perhaps even John on that hillside years later. The question lingers, was Dutch always destined to betray his family, or did one secret, one compromise, push him over the edge from flawed idealist to paranoid tyrant? The world was changing, and Dutch chose myth over truth. The next steps of this tale will show what that choice truly cost every lost soul who believed in him. From that question, the story turns inward, because the real answer is buried in every secret Dutch ever carried. The Vanderlinde Gang does not collapse in a single gunfight or a single betrayal. It unravels thread by thread, each lie, each omission, pulling the family further from its humble beginnings and closer to the cliff. The first secret is the one Dutch carries from the very beginning, the violence and humiliation of his youth that he never truly shares. There are hints of a cruel father, of a mother he adored, of early cons with Hosea that left innocent people dead. Dutch learns that memory is malleable, that a story can be edited until the teller becomes the hero. That private revelation becomes a philosophy. If the past can be rewritten, then so can the present, and any necessary sacrifice can be folded into a grand narrative of freedom and resistance. From that seed grow the structural secrets that define the gang's inner world. Dutch and Hosea operate as an unspoken high council, deciding who hears what, who gets trusted with real numbers, who is kept in the dark. Money is hidden in quiet stashes, in banks, in safety deposit boxes that only Dutch and Hosea know. He preaches equality around the campfire, but he designs a system where information flows one way, up to him. The consequence is subtle at first. When Blackwater goes bad and the ferry heist turns into a massacre, no one knows how much was really at stake, or how much Dutch has already lost. So they cannot challenge his version of events, wavering loyalty, always emphasizing the times he saved them, downplaying the times they saved him. He flatters Arthur as the living embodiment of his ideals while quietly sidelining his doubts. He scolds John for running off, yet omits his own failures as a surrogate father. In the truest sense, their love becomes a weapon he wields. The cost is trust. When Arthur finally sees through the fade at Beaver Hollow, every earlier omission snaps into focus, and the bond that once held the gang together becomes the very thing that shatters it. Around all this swirl the external secrets. Dutch's quiet meetings with Angelo Bronte in Saint Denis, his arrogant underestimation of the Pinkertons, his late-night conversations with Micah that no one else hears. Each deal is framed as an opportunity, a clever move against civilization, but the real dangers are hidden. Bronte's betrayal leads to Jack's kidnapping. The Pinkertons' patience runs out in that doomed bank. Micah's whispers feed Dutch's paranoia until he turns on Arthur, on John, on the very idea of family. Piece by piece, each secret leaves a grave behind. Sean in Rhodes, Hosea and Lenny in Saint Denis, Miss Grimshaw at Beaver Hollow, Arthur on that mountainside. A story of freedom becomes a trail of broken bodies, and through it all, Dutch insists he has a plan. The next steps of this tale will show what that plan truly was, and why, in a world where the old ways were dying, Dutch chose to drag everyone he loved down with him rather than face the truth he had buried for so long. Dutch dragging everyone down with him is not just the end of one outlaw band. It is a story of what happens when grand ideals collide with a world that refuses to bend. From the very beginning, the Vanderlinde Gang lives inside those binaries the West was built on, idealism and reality. freedom and civilization, loyalty and betrayal. On one side stands Dutch's philosophy, dressed up in borrowed revolutionary language and half-remembered political tracts. He talks about liberty, about equality, about taking from the rich parasites who feast on the poor. On the other side stand the bodies in Rhodes, in St. Denis, in the snow. Every robbery, every necessary sacrifice exposes the gap between the dreams he sells and the delusions he lives by. In the truest sense, the gang becomes a moving argument about whether ideals can survive contact with hunger, fear, and a loaded gun. That tension mirrors the country around them. The Vanderlinde Gang is a microcosm of America itself, born from its humble beginnings in rebellion against distant power, promising freedom and a chance at a better life, yet built through violence, theft, and quiet exploitation. They camp on stolen land, they profit from chaos, they talk about justice, while ignoring the people crushed beneath their horses' hooves. Is that not the living embodiment of a nation that preaches equality while running on railroads laid over broken treaties and unmarked graves? Dutch's rhetoric echoes the great manifestos of revolution, but his actions echo something older and smaller: personal greed, wounded pride, and festering fear. He secretly hoards information about money stashes, cuts private deals with men like Angelo Bronte, entertains dangerous flatterers such as Micah because they tell him he is right when Hosea and Arthur tell him he is wrong. History is full of movements betrayed from within when leaders confuse the cause with their own ego. Dutch simply does it on horseback, yet the myth endures. The campfire glow, the shared meals, the laughter after a job well done create a fantasy that still pulls at the heart. A found family outside a corrupt system, simple rules, clear loyalties, a small world where everyone knows their place. Even knowing how it ends, there is a strange comfort in that vision, in the idea that a lost soul can be taken in, given purpose, given a name that means more than blood. In the end, what the gang represents is not fixed on the page. It depends on the eyes that look back. Judge Dutch as a visionary or a tyrant, Arthur as a murderer or a man seeking redemption, John as a coward or a survivor, Hosea as a dreamer or an enabler, and the story changes shape. The next part of this tale will ask what those choices reveal, not only about them, but about the world that still clings to their legend. And when the world looks back at that legend, it does not see one fixed truth. It sees fragments, reflections, and the long echo of choices that never really ended. The story of the Vanderlinde Gang becomes a mirror, and every survivor, every witness, carries a different version into the new century. John Marston carries it as a warning. From its humble beginnings, his life was bound to Dutch's philosophy, to dreams of freedom that always seemed one score away. On the ranch at Beecher's Hope, he tries to turn that history into a cautionary tale, trading train robberies for fence posts, gun smoke for the quiet sounds of a family trying to heal. Yet every time he picks up a rifle for the government, every time he hunts down the ghosts of his past, it proves how hard it is to escape the orbit of a man who taught him that violence could be righteous. Sadie Adler carries it as a weapon. Dutch's failures, Arthur's death, the gang's betrayal of its own ideals, these do not soften her, they harden her. She becomes the living embodiment of what happens when grief is given no place to rest, roaming the world as a bounty hunter, chasing outlaws who resemble the people she once called family. In the truest sense, she is forged by loss, not by Dutch's words, but by the gap between what he promised and what he delivered. Others vanish into rumor. Javier becomes a revolutionary in Mexico, Bill a petty warlord hiding behind crumbling walls, Charles a quiet protector trying to shield what remains of a dying people. They drift through a world where the old ways were dying, each one a lost soul shaped by a man who preached loyalty while practicing secrecy. The wider world remembers the gang more crudely. Wanted posters nailed to telegraph poles, campfire stories told by men who never met them, half-true legends in cheap dime novels that turn Dutch into either a noble rebel standing against civilization or a mad villain who burned everything he touched. The complicated man in the middle, the charming outlaw who read political tracts, quoted philosophy, and lied to his own family, rarely survives on the page, because the real cost of Dutch's secrets is not just counted in bodies. It is measured in trust shattered, in the way his hidden deals and quiet compromises turned love into disillusionment and hope into bitterness. Arthur's faith curdles into clarity. Hosea's partnership ends in a moment of stunned betrayal. John's belief dies on a cliff, with Dutch walking away rather than admitting what he has become. And beneath all of it sits a harder question. Why are figures like Dutch so compelling in the first place? Charismatic leaders with big ideas and hidden flaws, promising freedom from a rigged world, offering family to those who have none. How easily do desperate people ignore the red flags when belonging is on the table? How often does a story of resistance become a story of control the moment no one is allowed to question the man in charge? From the very beginning, Dutch claimed to be fighting civilization. In the end, he became one of its cruelest lessons. For those who have walked through this entire tale, the myth can never fully return to what it was. The next and final step is to take that changed perspective back to the games themselves, and to see Dutch not as the legend says he is, but as his actions prove he was. From that moment on, the legend is broken. What remains is judgment. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, now demands a verdict on the man who stood at its center and called himself a prophet of freedom. So where was the true point of no return for this outlaw family? Was it hidden in the very beginning, in those early cons where Dutch and Hosea let innocent people die, then rewrote the past as necessary sacrifice? If the first secret was blood quietly spilled for a philosophy, then perhaps the gang was doomed from its humble beginnings, long before Arthur ever held a gun in Dutch's name. Or did the ground give way at Blackwater when Dutch ignored Hosea's caution, hoarded information about the ferry job, and turned a risky robbery into a massacre? That single decision shatters the illusion that everyone shares the same danger and the same truth. Dutch knows more, risks others more, and tells them less. From that day, the living embodiment of rebellion begins to resemble the very tyrants he claims to hate. Some will say the real break comes in St. Denis, in the shadow of Angelo Bronte's mansion. Dutch secretly negotiates, trades Jack's safety for a fragile alliance, then throws it away the moment his pride is wounded. Hosea dies on those steps, Lenny follows, and Dutch walks out preaching that it was all part of the plan. Was that the instant his philosophy finally rotted into pure delusion? Others will point to Hosea's absence itself. Without the old partner who could cut through the speeches and see the world as it really was, Dutch becomes a man unchallenged, an idealistic thinker with no anchor. When Micah steps into that void, flattering him, feeding his paranoia, is that when the gang's fate is sealed? Or was the true betrayal far smaller and more personal? The first time Dutch dismissed Arthur's doubts. The first time he looked at John and saw a threat instead of a son? Every player reaches a private breaking point. For some, it is Dutch leaving John to die on the mountain. For others, it is the cold refusal to help the Wapiti, or the decision to abandon Arthur in the mud while riding off with Micah. The moment trust dies, Arthur's quiet resistance, John's wary distance, even Sadie's ferocity all begin to look different. Once the mask slips, every campfire story sounds like a warning that was missed. This saga is, in the truest sense, a story of a man and a world where the old ways were dying. Was Dutch a tragic idealist swallowed by changing civilization, or a hidden tyrant exposed at last? That judgment belongs to those who have walked beside Arthur and John, watched the gang rise, and felt it fall. Those same eyes can choose where this long-form campfire of stories travels next. Perhaps the next trail leads into Micah's shadowed past, the quiet dignity and rage of Charles Smith, the strange, haunted world of the strange man, or the cold machinery of the Pinkertons who hunted the gang from one dying frontier town to the next. Each faction hides its own secrets, its own philosophy, its own small betrayals that echo Dutch's fall. This channel stands as a camp pitched on the edge of a fading frontier, returning to myths not to worship them, but to take them apart and rebuild them piece by piece. Subscribing is not a passing gesture, it is a decision to keep returning to that fire, to hear every hidden chapter of this world told in full. The next question waiting in the dark is simple. If Dutch was not the last outlaw myth, then who truly was? The next question waiting in the dark hangs over the same image that opened this entire tale. The Vanderlinde Gang as shadows on a distant ridge, silhouettes cut against a bleeding sky. From its humble beginnings, that line of riders seemed simple, almost romantic, outlaws chasing freedom across a land that still looked endless. Now every shape on that horizon carries names, wounds, and secrets that can never be put back. Seen from the very beginning, it was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family built in defiance of a closing world. Dutch Vanderlinde stood at the center of it, a man convinced that the world was changing too fast, that the old ways were dying before they had even been lived honestly. His answer was not to surrender, but to build a philosophy, a family, a campfire that claimed to stand against civilization itself. In the truest sense, Dutch tried to outrun history. He gathered lost souls and misfits, turned conmen into believers, turned a petty thief named Arthur into the living embodiment of his ideals. He preached freedom, preached that no man should kneel to a king or a company, preached that their crimes were a protest rather than a hunger. Yet every sermon carried a shadow, every rousing speech hid one more truth kept behind his eyes. Dutch wanted proof that his ideals were real, so he built a family. He wanted proof that the world was rigged, so he kept pushing that family into the teeth of danger. Each secret deal, each hidden stash, each whispered compromise with the very forces he claimed to despise, pulled him further from the man Hosea once rode beside. In the end, he did not lose everything because the Pinkertons were clever or the government was strong. He lost it because he chose secrecy over trust, control over honesty, myth over the men and women who believed in him. This channel exists to follow stories like that all the way to their last ember. To treat game narratives as serious, as layered, as tragic and meticulous as any epic film or novel. A story of outlaws becomes a lens on power and progress. A dying camp on the edge of a swamp becomes a thesis about what happens when ideals are used as armor for pride. For those who wish to stay in this world a little longer, the trail does not end here. Those rides through Coulter's blizzards, the tense dinners at Clemens Point, the whispered arguments in Beaver Hollow, how many of those scenes now look different, knowing every secret Dutch carried? Which moment marks the true breaking point? Blackwater, Guarma, or the first time he lied to Hosea and did not flinch? The invitation is simple. Return to those moments with new eyes, wander through the other tales waiting here, or step into the comments and put Dutch's philosophy on trial. Was he a prophet of freedom, or just another outlaw dressing selfishness in poetry? As long as those questions are asked, the gang still rides. So the camera drifts back to the campfire one last time. The flames are low, the coffee is cold, the tents stand half empty. One horse pulls away from the circle and moves toward the pale edge of dawn, hooves soft in the dust, silhouette shrinking into the light. The old ways were dying, but the story does not. As long as voices return to this fire, as long as the myths are told and challenged, the Vanderlinde Gang never fully disappears into the dust.